Flying saucers, little green men, and anal probes have been a staple of our perception of aliens for as long as most of us have been alive. The reasoning behind the latter is obvious. Human scientists also can and do learn a lot about an animal by their feces. But where did the idea of short grey or green aliens actually come from in the first place? As to little green men, the concept of green beings has been around for centuries, from goblins to perhaps one of the most famous cases, the Green Children of Woolpit. For those not familiar, these were two children that seemed to have lived during the 12th century in England. When they were discovered in the fields, the little boy and the girl had green-tinged skin, they wore strange clothes, spoke an unfamiliar language, and both refused to eat regular food for some time, apparently being unfamiliar with it. If you're interested in who they were, why their skin was green, and where they came from, do check out our video on the subject, which is linked to below. Fast forwarding to the 19th century, we have the first known instance of the term little green men being used to describe aliens, found in The Green Boy from Hurrah, published in the Atlanta Constitution in 1899. In the story, it describes a short green-skinned alien from, you guessed it, the planet Hurrah. Much more famously, Edgar Rice Burroughs' early 20th century Barsoom series featured green aliens from Mars, though in this case they weren't little at all, being about twice the height of humans. Yet another mention from the early 20th century comes from the 1908 edition of the Daily Kennebec Journal, where the term little green man is used referring to a Martian. By the time of Orson Welles' famed War of the Worlds broadcast in October of 1938, it would appear this idea was firmly established in pop culture. After the supposed mass panic that happened during that broadcast, which in truth didn't actually happen, contrary to popular belief, more on this in an upcoming video on our Highlight History channel, subscribe to that by the way, this nevertheless saw many columnists reporting on it the next day, using the term little green men synonymously with alien. As is often the case today, these accounts seem to mostly use the term in jest to poke fun at the whole thing rather than literally describing aliens. This trope has pretty much survived ever since in pop culture, with short green aliens appearing in countless fictional productions, including Doctor Who, Star Trek, Toy Story, and perhaps the most famous of all little green aliens, Jedi Master Yoda. Interestingly, despite widespread reference to little green men in many a news account describing potential abductions, among the alien abductions posited by ufologists as being somewhat credible, there has not yet been anywhere someone has claimed to have been abducted by little green men type aliens. Though lizard people are a thing, which we'll be getting to in an upcoming video, assuming the lizard people don't silence us first. In contrast to the lack of little green men abductions, little grey humanoids is a popular description given by those who claim to have been abducted, accounting for a whopping 43% of all alien abduction reports in the United States, 50% in Australia, and 90% in the United States' hat. As to why grey aliens prefer Canadians, we just think that's probably because they're really nice. Just as interesting is that only 12% of abduction reports in the UK and 20% in the rest of Europe describe some variant of grey-skinned aliens doing the abducting. So, where did the common idea of hairless, large-headed, black-eyed, grey-skinned aliens actually come from in the first place? The first documented instances of a description of such beings, though in this case with them being our evolved selves, comes from H.G. Wells's 1893 Man of the Year Million. In it, he describes humanity having evolved into large-headed, black, oval-eyed, short, grey-skinned beings, similar to what is commonly depicted when most people today think of grey aliens. Wells later repeated similar descriptions in other works, including sometimes representing aliens. Clearly, Wells must have been in the lizard people's inner circle to know about the grey aliens long before anyone would ever be abducted by them. From there, Gustav Sandgren doubled down on this description of aliens in his 1933 book titled The Unknown Danger, where he states, "The creatures did not resemble any race of humans. They were shorter than the average Japanese, and their heads were big and bald, with strong square foreheads and very small noses and mouths and weak chins. What was most extraordinary about them were the eyes, large, dark, gleaming with a sharp gaze. They wore clothes made of soft grey fabric, and their limbs seemed to be similar to those of humans." Fast forwarding to 1947, the Roswell UFO incident purports to have featured little grey aliens, which has since further kept the trope alive. That said, perhaps no other event solidified the idea of grey aliens in pop culture more than one of the first ever instances of a supposed real-life alien abduction. The people abducted were a husband and wife couple named Barney and Betty Hill in 1961. In a nutshell, the couple were driving home from a trip late at night on September 19, 1961 in New Hampshire when, at approximately 10:30 p.m., Betty claims to have seen a mysterious light off in the distance. Eventually, the couple decided to stop the car and investigate, as well as allow their dog to water some trees. In the meantime, Barney used a pair of binoculars to get a closer look at the mysterious light and observed a flying saucer of some sort off in the distance. From here, there is a gap in their memories until they were about 35 miles down the road. Perplexed with about 2 hours of missing time, the missing memories of part of their road trip, minor scrapes and some damage to their clothing and back of their car, they otherwise shrugged it off and went to bed when they got home. Shortly thereafter, Betty read a book about UFOs and then began to have some strange dreams, with her speculating to Barney that maybe they had been abducted by aliens, as she vividly experienced in her dreams. Her husband, however, was having none of it at first, that is, until 2 years later, when he and Betty underwent hypnosis to try and draw out repressed memories, and then he started remembering the event himself. In short, Betty gave two accounts, one from her dreams and one from her supposedly recovered repressed memories, which differed considerably on several points. What she ended up supposedly remembering was some reasonably friendly, grey hairless aliens, initially claiming with huge bulbous noses, though she changed her story on that one later. The aliens then took them aboard their ship and gave them a thorough and violating examination. At one point, while chatting with Betty in English, but seemingly telepathically, one of the examiners showed her a star chart map of where they came from. Her husband also had similar memories, though less detailed, as apparently he kept his eyes closed much of the time because of the alien eyes feeling like they were boring into his brain. He did report being probed anally, as well as having some of his sperm extracted, among other things more or less similar to Betty's experience. However, among various discrepancies between their stories, he described the aliens as having hair and wearing Nazi-like uniforms. However, as we noted in our video about whether repressed memories are actually a thing, the methods used in hypnosis to try and recover suppressed memories are quite literally textbook ways to get people to create false memories, sometimes even quite fantastical ones. Thus, purported memories recovered in this way tend to be treated with a bit of skepticism in modern times. And in fact, even then, the psychiatrist who hypnotized them, Dr. Benjamin Simon, concluded this very thing, that while he fully believed Betty and then Barney were completely sincere that they had been abducted, the good doctor believed their memories were not real and simply inspired by Betty's dreams and research of various alien-related content. Dr. Simon was apparently well ahead of his time. On that note, a lot of the elements the couple described about the aliens resembled those already depicted in various works of fiction. Further, the technologies the aliens used were amazingly antiquated, mirroring the types of things you'd expect of someone living in 1961. On top of that, a beacon light on Canyon Mountain existed that was fully visible on the road approximately where Betty and Barney claimed to have seen the mysterious light. Betty's later accounts of additional experiences with aliens would further erode her credibility in the eyes of most ufologists. As noted by the paranormal investigator Robert Schaefer, I was present at the National UFO Conference in New York City in 1980, at which Betty presented some of the UFO photos she had taken. She showed what must have been well over 200 slides, mostly of blips, blurs, and blobs against a dark background. These were supposed to be UFOs coming in close, chasing her car, landing, etc. After her talk had exceeded about twice its allocated time, Betty was literally jeered off the stage by what had been, at first, a very sympathetic audience. This incident, witnessed by many ufology leaders and top activists, removed any lingering doubts about Betty's credibility. She had none. In 1995, Betty Hill wrote a self-published book, A Common Sense Approach to UFOs. It is filled with obviously delusional stories, such as seeing entire squadrons of UFOs in flight and a truck levitating above the freeway. Nevertheless, the original incident made the news rounds and even inspired some predictions based on the event, helping to popularize and reinforce the notion of grey aliens, even if not exactly as is otherwise commonly depicted. In fact, because of Betty and Barney, grey aliens are sometimes called Zeta Reticulans. This comes from the fact that Betty's drawing of the star map she supposedly saw while on the ship was determined to line up with a binary system about 39.2 light-years away from Earth called Zeta Reticuli. That said, the idea that her depiction matched Zeta Reticuli was later debunked for various reasons. Nevertheless, the name has stuck. On top of helping to popularize the Greys, the Betty and Barney abduction ended up kicking off a slew of others claiming that they were likewise abducted, with relatively similar stories. The stereotypical view of Grey aliens that had been around for over half a century up to that point was subsequently continually reinforced in cinema and TV, such as in the 1977 Close Encounters of the Third Kind, as well as the 1989 Communion, starring Christopher Walken, based off the New York Times best-selling book of the same name released 2 years before. After that came The X-Files, Stargate SG-1, South Park, and many more productions featuring some variant of the Greys, ensuring the stereotype lives on long past H.G. Wells, who seemingly originally came up with it, or so the lizard people would want to have us believe. And let's get into those bonus facts. While today pretty much everyone pronounces UFO as UFO, it turns out that's not the way the person who suggested the phrase unidentified flying object, one Edward J. Ruppelt, pronounced it. You see, when Ruppelt suggested the name to describe these types of sightings rather than flying saucer as was previously popular among the general public, he helpfully included a description of how to pronounce it. So how did he say it? Well, that was UFO, and while UFO did catch on, UFO certainly didn't. And now for another bonus fact. Ever wonder why people think Area 51 houses aliens? Well, want to know more? It turns out it's all because of one random man. In 1989, yes, that recently, a guy by the name of Robert Lazar appeared on a Las Vegas TV station saying he was a government scientist and stated that Area 51 was just chock full of alien technology. After that, interest in Area 51 and aliens really started to gain momentum. Now, we should probably mention that almost as soon as Lazar appeared on TV, every single one of his credentials was pulled to pieces. No school he claimed to attend had ever heard of him, and the science behind his presented hypotheses was soundly debunked. And yes, to really just drive the point home here, Roswell, UFOs, aliens, little green men, and Area 51 were in no way linked as far as popular public opinion was concerned until exactly one random dude went on TV and claimed that they were. Science. On that note, it's important to realize what Area 51 actually is. For all intents and purposes, and according to every government document ever released, Area 51 is a secret, but not so secret, military base where they test experimental pieces of military hardware. For example, experimental jets such as the SR-71 Blackbird and the Lockheed U-2 Dragon Lady were tested at the Area 51 base. The latter of which was actually the first piece of hardware publicly known to have been constructed and tested there. The site Area 51 was built on was first chosen due to the incredibly smooth land found on nearby lake beds, coupled with the area's natural inaccessibility. Both of these features made it perfect for testing aircraft like the Lockheed U-2, which required a large area of flat land from which it could take off and land, while at the same time being in an area enemies of the US couldn't, at the time, easily lay their peepers on. As for what it's like to work at Area 51, unlike pop culture would have you believe, the people who work there aren't forbidden from ever speaking to their family or are held in some sort of giant underground bunker. Just ask James Nose, who worked in the secret facility for decades. Though James has been sworn to secrecy about certain things, as is expected when you work on highly experimental classified government projects, he's free to talk about many of his experiences there. For example, James noted that he was always paid in cash, whereas others were paid in checks from companies they didn't work for. Even more interesting, when a plane from Area 51 crashed once, James was tasked with confiscating the cameras of a nearby family, who were quickly rewarded with a fat stack of cash for their silence about what they saw. So what about Roswell and Area 51? Surely there must have been some popular connection before the late 1980s, right? Well, not so much. Though today, some conspiracy theorists believe that the craft that crashed at Roswell was of alien origin and that it was or is now being stored at Area 51, when the incident in question first took place, Area 51 wasn't mentioned in any documentation from that time. This should come as zero surprise to anyone who knows their geography, as Area 51 is almost 1,000 miles from Roswell, so why they'd have transported it and the aliens inside all that way instead of to some other secret installation is a bit of a mystery, and certainly not something anyone in the public at the time would connect, even if it were true. And now for another bonus fact. Ever wonder what aliens might look like if we did encounter them? While you might think that this is unknowable, and to some extent that is correct, there is a notion called convergent evolution that at least gives us some indications. The general idea here comes from the fact that various life forms have independently evolved a lot of the same basic features on Earth, completely separate from each other. And given that many other planets would have relatively similar conditions as Earth in terms of some level of light, gravitational force, and living creatures needing to intake sustenance for energy, etc., it is likely that an intelligent and advanced species would have certain broad features we can make assumptions about. As Professor Harry E. Keller of Northeastern University notes, Eyes? Of course. You'd have to see to be able to build a civilization. The squid has better eyes than we do, and the eye seems to have evolved separately a few times at least. Our alien will have eyes that may only resemble ours superficially. A lens and iris are almost an absolute requirement. The whites do not have to be white. Neither does the iris have to be colored in anything like the way ours are. How many eyes? One just will not do. Inability to perceive distance will lead to rapid extinction. Unless you can find a good reason for it, extra eyes create evolutionary baggage and will not persist, spiders notwithstanding. Eyes being important, they will be recessed and capable of being covered as necessary. Our aliens are not likely to be bug-eyed, though we cannot totally rule that out. Mouth must have means for ingestion of food. All large animals have some means to capture and swallow food. Some masticate it, others do not. Teeth are rather common on Earth, but other systems of eating are possible. The problem is that plants and animals have been in an evolutionary war for millennia. We inherit the outcome of that war. Teeth were necessary to eat plants that became more fibrous, an evolutionary reaction to being eaten. There are other ways to shear off plant food, such as what birds do. They chew in their gizzards. A similar line of thinking is that a technologically advanced species is likely to have a good way to manipulate objects in complex ways, as this is a huge boon to an advancement of a species in the first place. Thus, something like hands and opposable thumbs would also seem to be more likely to be present in a spacefaring life form that we might encounter. Some sort of hard protective structure to store the central processing unit, or units, i.e. the brain or brain centers, are also speculated to be likely for similar reasons to so many creatures on Earth evolving this feature. Evolutionary biologist Dr. Simon Conway Morris adds, "Certainly, it's not the case that every Earth-like planet will have life, let alone humanoids. But if you want a sophisticated plant, it will look awfully like a flower. If you want to fly, there's only a few ways you can do that. If you want to swim like a shark, there's only a few ways you can do that. If you want to invent warm-bloodedness like birds and mammals, there's only a few ways to do that. There is a growing interest in convergent evolution, but I'm always willing to push it as far as I can. I'll always say, show me anything which has only evolved once, and I'll try and jump up and say, no, I can give you another example. Convergence is ubiquitous, and if you think complex things are difficult to make, well, with great respect, think again." The sum of all this is to point out that while Hollywood often depicts humanoid-like intelligent beings for convenience in casting actors and reducing special effects budgets, it's not outside the realm of possibility that aliens really would be at least slightly humanoid, with some form of eyes, ears, hands, limbs for moving about and grabbing things, etc. Of course, having all these features doesn't necessarily mean looking that close to a human. After all, an octopus is not that far from the basic recipe for a species with the potential to be technologically advanced if they evolved the right means for communication and things of this nature. But it, at least according to this hypothesis, makes it not unlikely that we might encounter aliens at some point that look not too dissimilar to ourselves or something that we're familiar with. That said, Seth Shostak and Susan Schneider of the SETI Institute posit that it is far more likely that any other beings we encounter would be of the machine variety. Their reasoning is that, to begin with, as any species advances to the point of space travel or sending communications across vast distances in space, thus ones we are more likely to encounter, they will likely have come up with something like the computers we have today to offload various brainpower tasks to machinery. Ultimately, they will then advance those systems to the point where they are superior to the biological brain's potential. At some point beyond that, they will likely figure out how to transfer their own sentience and memories to the machines, or create machines that are themselves independently sentient. Because such machine beings would be superior to biological beings in countless ways, including ability to rapidly self-improve and replicate in much more advanced ways, they would ultimately come to dominate. Even in societies that took active steps to avoid this, these groups would have much more trouble with interstellar space travel than their machine alternates, and thus it would ultimately be unlikely for us to encounter those biologicals compared to our chances of encountering the machines. On that note, grey aliens are often described by supposed abductees as having seemingly artificially smooth skin, like it's made of some sort of polymer rather than being biological. This, combined with the fact that many abductees state that even when the greys were staring them straight in the eyes inches away from their faces, they could not detect any breathing or the like, has lent some to speculate the greys are not actually biological beings, but rather robots, clearly created by the lizard people to do their bidding.
thanks to Hollywood, as well as words written on the mangled, inked corpses of the leafy fellow occupants of our little planet we've successfully subjugated, there are a number of common ideas about how an alien invasion of Earth would go. From clandestine infiltration, where our celestial enemies walk among us undetected, to these brothers from another primordial goop mother coming with energy weapons ablazing. But in real life, what would likely happen if aliens did invade? Are aliens even currently visiting us? And does any government in the world have a plan to deal with this situation? As to the latter question, somewhat surprisingly, given organizations like the US military tend to take the stance of being obscenely overprepared for any and all possible conflicts, the answer appears to be no. No plan is in place whatsoever by any government. Even the United States' much maligned Space Force has no such plan or any plan to make one. Not just that, but in an effort to attempt to be taken more seriously, the Space Force has even shunned so much as wanting to be in charge of investigating the possibility of aliens checking us out in the form of UFOs, or if we want to use the more trendy term, unidentified anomalous phenomena, or UAP. As one US Department of Defense rep stated when asked about all of this, the Department of Defense does not maintain plans for hypothetical dangers for which we have absolutely no information, either to the likelihood of the danger or to what form the danger would take. Corroborating that, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, Christopher Carr Merlin, who also apparently in a bid to hold the two biggest mouthful job titles in the world, was once the Staff Director of the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, notes of this, quote, "I think you got an honest answer from the DoD. How would you plan for the arrival of an advanced civilization without any understanding whatsoever of their capabilities, technology, or intentions? Meanwhile, the DoD has an overflowing plate already, and I suspect the Joint Staff has little patience for such seemingly unlikely, open-ended and ill-defined scenarios. If such an event occurred, we'd simply have to muddle through as best we could." Jumping across the pond to the UK, it seems that they too are likewise unprepared, with former official for the British Ministry of Defence, Nick Pope, stating that despite him advocating for the creation of such a plan, quote, "there was no real enthusiasm for it. It was a combination of scepticism and almost this feeling that this was the ultimate taboo, that something like this could just not be put down on paper." As for Russia, one Sergei Berezhnoy of the Titov Space Control Center stated, "The Russian air defense have not been tasked with preparing for the contingency of an alien attack. There are enough problems on Earth and in near-Earth space." The UN also seems to have nothing on the books, nor any international agreements for how to coordinate anything involving an alien invasion, and pretty much all countries the world over seem to take the same stance. We've got better things to do. Although one would think at least a treaty by all nations to agree to band together and work out some of the details on how that would work wouldn't be a total waste of time, let alone even provide a little perspective on unity. And speaking of that, such an agreement and a bit of perspective did at least loosely occur between two world superpowers at one point in history. During the 1985 Geneva summit, according to then Secretary of State George Shultz, US President Ronald Reagan said to Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, "What would you do if the United States were suddenly attacked by someone from outer space? Would you help us?" Gorbachev's response was, "No doubt about it." And then Reagan stated, "We too." And the two apparently had a chuckle about it being at least one scenario they'd be able to work freely on together with zero political friction. So while later on in this video we're going to get to what would likely be the best plan if aliens invade, currently no government seems to have a plan, or at least not one that anyone wants to admit to. And from quotes from people working at various governments in their respective defense departments, there does seem to be a bit of a stigma against pursuing anything like this. Most likely because the aliens have already infiltrated our top commands and want to make sure we remain unprepared. Now that brings us to the question of whether aliens are currently visiting us. While it's always possible, the answer appears to be, if they are, nobody knows about it, not even anyone in the militaries of the world. So why does this seem to be the case? Well, the lack of preparation is a good sign, even by, again, an agency like the US Department of Defense that spends money like they're printing it and seemingly always looks for more funding, despite already spending about $750 billion per year, which for reference is about 3 times more than any other nation spends on defense, with the runner-up being China at $250 billion. If they, or any other nation, knew of aliens popping by to say hi, the most logical thing to do would be to start preparing for a potential invasion. Because, those in power live here on Earth too, as do their families. And beyond that, their positions of power would be a bit precarious if aliens did invade. There's also, once again, the funding aspect of things, and the benefits to letting John Q. taxpayer know about the aliens if we know they are visiting. As Elon Musk notes, we're constantly trying to get the defense budget to expand. And look, what would really get no arguments from anyone? If we pulled out an alien and said, we need money to protect ourselves from these guys. How much do you want? You've got it. They look dangerous. So the fastest way to get a defense budget increase would be to pull out an alien. And if you're wondering on Musk's thoughts on if aliens are currently visiting Earth, quote, a lot of people ask me, where are the aliens? And I think if anyone would know about aliens on Earth, it would probably be me, and I've seen no evidence of aliens. I would immediately tweet it out. That would probably be the top tweet of all time. We found one, guys. It's the jackpot with some 8 billion likes. No doubt it would also see some major funding thrown his SpaceX company's way as well, so not just dealing in social media jackpots, but, well, cash ones too. Further, it's not like the idea of whether aliens are visiting us hasn't ever been explored by the US military. For starters, after the rise in UFO sightings in the 1940s, the military wanted the potential threat assessed, being their job and all to defend their nation from any potential threats, and again, they live here on Earth too. And so enter the picture Captain Edward J. Ruppelt. Initially, it was Ruppelt's job to review reports on flying saucers, as they were then called, and present his findings to the Pentagon. You see, since at least 1947, the US government has been studying reports of flying saucers as part of Project Sign and later Project Grudge. The original goal of each of these projects was to discern, first, whether any reports of flying saucers were credible, and second, whether they represented a threat to the United States. The problem was that both Sign and Grudge came at the issue from a rather biased perspective. Ruppelt himself would criticize both projects for being over-politicized, noting of these investigations, in doing this, standard intelligence procedures normally means an unbiased evaluation of intelligence data. But it doesn't take a great deal of study of the old UFO files to see that standard intelligence procedures were not being followed by Project Grudge. Everything was being evaluated on the premise that UFOs couldn't exist. No matter what you see or hear, don't believe it. On top of this, it was eventually discovered by military brass, most notably General Charles Cabell, that those working on Project Grudge often weren't actually investigating reports coming in that they claimed they were. Instead, in many cases, they were simply coming up with debunking explanations off the top of their heads, regardless of how tenuous their explanations were. According to Ruppelt, the advent of more sophisticated radar technology and certain seemingly credible reports of UFOs throughout the early 1950s are what eventually encouraged said high-ranking government officials to deem the phenomena worthy of actual rigorous study, free from any preconceptions. In his words, quote, airline pilots, military pilots, generals, scientists, and dozens of other people were reporting UFOs, and in greater detail than in reports of the past. Radars, which were being built for air defense, began to pick up some very unusual targets, thus lending technical corroboration to the unsubstantiated claims of human observers. As a result of the continuing accumulation of more impressive UFO reports, official interest stirred. And this, finally, is where Ruppelt got his chance to shine. Chosen to head up Project Blue Book, Edward J. Ruppelt was handpicked for both his reputation as a gifted organizer as well as his known open-mindedness towards the possibility that at least some of the UFO sightings being reported were of genuine extraterrestrial origin. In short, for once, certain military brass wanted the issue to actually be investigated properly to determine if there was any validity to any of it. If there was, the military could then react appropriately, make a plan, and no doubt get insanely expanded budgets that even the Cold War wasn't providing them. Or if no aliens were found, they could at least show they'd done their due diligence in debunking the idea. Needless to say, when Ruppelt began Project Blue Book, he was determined that the biases that had thwarted the previous two projects looking into the phenomenon of UFOs would not be present. In fact, he even went so far as to dismiss anyone who seemed to demonstrate any bias on either side of the argument. He wanted his people to be able to approach each reported UFO case with an open mind. Incidentally, beyond this, Ruppelt also set about addressing a particular bugbear of his, the term flying saucer, writing, obviously, the term flying saucer is misleading when applied to objects of every conceivable shape and performance. For this reason, the military prefers the more general, if less colorful name, unidentified flying objects, UFO for short. And yes, you heard that right, we've all been saying UFO wrong according to the coiner of the term. It's supposed to be pronounced UFO. In any event, while at the helm of the project, an era generally referred to by ufologists as the golden age of Project Blue Book, Ruppelt lamented the fact that his team were perpetually understaffed. He did, however, know that the Air Force brass gave his team top-secret security clearance, allowing them to interview any military personnel they wanted, regardless of rank, as well as just generally bypass any bureaucratic red tape they might have otherwise encountered while trying to get to the bottom of every reported case of a UFO that came in. Not only this, but each US Air Force base was assigned a Blue Book officer in charge of collecting UFO reports for Ruppelt. After investigating some 4,500 UFO reports, Ruppelt officially retired from the Air Force and Project Blue Book in 1953, though the project technically continued without him until January of 1970. And if you're interested, you can read some of the now declassified UFO investigations comprising 100,000 pages on the National Archives website or at Project Blue Book Archive. As I'm guessing nobody has the time to actually read those, we'll just note that of the 12,618 UFO reports investigated, the vast majority were concluded to be things like sightings of naturally occurring phenomena or experimental aircraft. As for the exceptions, some 701 unidentified flying object reports, about 5%, remained officially unidentified. Unsurprisingly, given the vast amount of data they collected without a single definitive positive sighting of an extraterrestrial UFO, the conclusion of Project Blue Book was that, quote, 1. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. 2. There has been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. And 3. There has been no evidence indicating that sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles. End quote. Rubble'd himself seems to have agreed with these sentiments, writing shortly before his death from a heart attack at the age of 37, though while he remained open-minded about potential extraterrestrial UFOs, the thousands of reports to date he'd investigated personally seemed to demonstrate the idea of extraterrestrial UFOs as a space-age myth. Of course, this hasn't stopped ufologists who generally insist that at least some of the unsolved cases totally were extraterrestrial vehicles. Apparently, Ruppel wasn't fooling anyone with his government information on UFOs, his top-secret clearance, and his rigorous research practices. All that said, that was then. This is now. In relatively recent times, discussions about aliens visiting us once again ramped up thanks to even more grainy sightings, including by many a military pilot. As noted by Major General John Olson of the US Space Force when discussing the rise in unidentified flying objects and need for additional funding to look into it more, quote, "This is a very hot topic. I know, admittedly, Unidentified Aerial Phenomenon Task Force is quite a mouthful in an acronym. I've gotten the question a couple of other times, what do you think about UFOs or aliens? And quite frankly, having flown 83 different airplanes and had lots of hours, we've all seen lots of unexplainable elements. And the cosmos, the space realm, is so large. If we look at the Earth, it is this tiny blue dot in an unlimited, almost incomprehensibly large cosmos. I personally believe that there absolutely, from a probability perspective, is life out there. However, this task force is very serious US government approach to systematically investigating and understanding these, because of course unidentified elements present a national security concern, present a safety of flight, present a risk that we must take and diligently pursue. I believe it will be getting more funding and more of a structural support level within the department. Unfortunately, so far it would seem that the vast majority of such UFOs investigated can be easily explained by things like simple drones, which would also go a long way in explaining why there has been a sudden spike when drone technology has become so prevalent. Given the extreme utility here, a relatively cheap technology like drones seems to have been, in recent years, an area of major development among various militaries, with perhaps the utility and cheapness of such best illustrated in the war in Ukraine, where the incredibly well-equipped Russian military has in part been flummoxed by the rampant Ukrainian use of drones. Difficult to detect, incredibly cheap, relatively fast, hard to stop before they do their thing, while Russia has been able to dominate the upper portions of the sky with their rather incredible and insanely expensive jets. But this has been largely irrelevant at lower altitudes, where modified and expensive drones are dropping small explosives as well as being used as extremely effective eyes in the sky, among a myriad of other uses that don't cost many thousands of dollars per hour to execute their mission, as do many modern traditional military aircraft. As such, particularly more budget-minded nations have been throwing their limited money at such technology of late and found them to be incredibly effective at a variety of things. And of course, with all these little highly maneuverable aircraft flying around, sightings of alleged extraterrestrial UFOs are spiking once again. Or as former US Deputy Director of National Intelligence Beth Sanner elaborates, these things aren't that hard to do. This is low-tech technology. And it brings up our vulnerabilities, really. The defense of the continental United States has been neglected for decades in terms of this kind of aerial threat. We've invested in ballistic missile defense, but not in this. And then we have this technology gap in terms of most of our radars are from the 1980s. And so that's when the filtering. It's because our processors, literally the ones that are attached to the radars, don't have the capability to look through that much material, and so we had to filter it to identify threats that look like things we recognize as threats. Speaking of that gap in defense, as the editor of The War Zone, Tyler Rogoway, who has for several years been documenting all known military UAP sightings, states, "It is clear that a very terrestrial adversary is toying with us in our own backyard using relatively simple technologies, drones and balloons, and making off with what could be the biggest intelligence haul of a generation." While that may disappoint some who hope the origins of all these events are far more exotic in nature, the strategic implications of these bold operations, which have been happening for years undeterred, are absolutely massive. Whatever your personal belief is on whether any of these sightings are actual alien probes or just some military's new toys, this all finally brings us to the question of what would a real alien invasion look like in terms of how they probably would do it and how the governments of the world would hypothetically react. As to the latter question, as evidenced by the fact that even at the height of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet leaders agreed they'd happily work together to counter any invasion, it seems likely that pretty much all governments, no matter their ideological differences or history of bad blood, would band together. But would this be pointless? Well, yes. Yes, it would. Not because we humans aren't resourceful or without some pretty awesome killing toys. On this one, the idea of alien technology being so advanced we'd be like cavemen going up against the modern military seems overblown. After all, going back to the previous drone discussion, a $100 camera-equipped drone from Walmart is massively less advanced than a $34 million SR-71, but both are super effective at being eyes in the sky. And arguably, the modern $100 drone is potentially even better for certain surveillance missions. But beyond all that, physics is physics, and even if you have an energy shield of some sort, which may or may not be possible, it's still got to absorb the force of some explosion or ballistic or the like, in the most extreme, something like a nuclear bomb. That's an awful lot of energy and heat to handle, and would presumably require an energy source akin in power to do so. Anything is possible, but just from the practical standpoint of ground troops walking around or individual craft, it seems unlikely they'd be impervious to attacks from a lot of our weaponry. For example, speaking of heat, would such a portable energy shield also protect against the superheating of the air around the alien after an explosion? In the case of a nuclear blast, if they are susceptible to ionizing radiation, does that energy shield protect against this? Or even if so, on all of this, area attacks work too. If you can't penetrate the shield at all, maybe detonate a giant bomb under the ground where they're standing and see how high they can be tossed before they come down and go splat. That's not to mention an EMP weapon to try and see if that works at taking out any of their technology. Or how about a directed energy weapon like a ramped up active denial system with the use of microwaves to essentially heat up whatever tissue it's pointed at? While ADS weapons are meant to be non-lethal, it's only a matter of ramping up the power to boil some alien blood, assuming they're organic, and in a way that the hypothetical energy shields might not be able to defend against. Again, that's assuming that they even have energy shields, which may or may not be possible. And if not, they're going to be relying on physical shielding, not too dissimilar to what we also have, unless they've created some new elements and materials suitable for shielding that we're ignorant of. But either way, we humans have gotten pretty good at figuring out how to punch holes in armor of any type, and ground troops walking around would presumably be pretty vulnerable. At the end of the day, a bullet probably kills just as well as a hypothetical phaser. Frankly, even a big stick whacked against an alien's body may work. Dead is dead either way. This could even be potentially easier than we think if the aliens are the size of a mouse or something. Just be a game of whack-a-mole, wouldn't it? As Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, who himself was one of the pilots who observed a bizarre UAP in 2004, stated of a potential invasion, "I think we're in good shape with the pew-pew missiles and should have no problem countering the mothership with the bang-bang. I'm confident we're prepared for an Independence Day scenario, and the American people should rest well knowing our tic-tac tactics are tip-top to give them tit for tat." That said, this wouldn't matter. The aliens wouldn't need any such advanced weaponry to win quite easily. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's talk about the aliens themselves and their motivations to see what an invasion might look like. While it's impossible to predict how a given alternate intelligent being would for sure think about things, it's likely they wouldn't be that different from us in some important ways. As astrobiologist Dirk Schulz-Machuch states, any intelligent alien species would likely have predatory roots, because the evolutionary trait of intelligence is promoted if you have to hunt for your food. A lion has to be smarter than a grazing antelope. A wolf has to be smarter than a mountain lion. Because it's not as strong, it has to anticipate the prey's next move and communicate with other wolves in the pack. At some point, a predatory species has to learn to hunt sustainably, otherwise prey and eventually predator become extinct. More likely, they would come to rely on additional food sources more predictable and long-term, as humans did when they developed agriculture. This requires even more social structure and communication. Social structure is key. It is critical to pass on knowledge gained through experience from one generation to the next, and a species social behavior cannot be too aggressive. Our close relatives, chimpanzees and gorillas, with whom we share 99 and 98% of our genes respectively, are characterized by male competition, aggression, and instigation of fear. Compare this to our hominid ancestor from more than 4 million years ago, Ardipithecus ramidus, who had a social system in which females chose their own partners. This led them to have reduced levels of aggression and more stable social arrangements, meaning that outsiders were more tolerant and innovations, such as the use of new tools, were more easily accepted by the community. Of course, we humans, the more benign lineage of the great apes, have a history marred by episodes of violence and savagery, but most of the time, even for long periods, we get along with each other. Collaboration prevails over competition. Without that cooperation, complex societies would be impossible. It would likely be the same for technologically advanced aliens, although their specific social structure may look very different. Here on Earth, the extreme case of eusociality may be relevant to our speculation about alien civilization. The swarm intelligence of social insects such as bees, ants, and termite colonies is quite astounding, and even found in a few mammal species such as the naked mole rat. Eusocial species are very sophisticated, with social cohesion, rudimentary language, sustainable farming practices, and self-built complex housing structures that they keep in sanitary conditions. There is a drawback to eusociality, however. Much of the individual organism's behavior is genetically programmed, and there is little ability to adapt to changing environmental conditions. A more individualistic approach to social structure, as with humans, seems more advantageous. He thus concludes, perhaps the biggest threat from intelligent extraterrestrials would come not from a desire to dominate. We love our dogs and cats, after all, even though they are less intelligent than we are, but from misunderstandings. Like humans, they would likely still have aggressive traits, since both of us in our past had to fight to arrive at the top of the food chain. Thus, it seems likely any species that advances to such an extreme level to traverse the vast distances between stars would have found the same benefit in learning to cooperate and ultimately valuing life, even less intelligent than their own, which also potentially may bode well for them coming not to conquer, but to say hi and get to know us. Of course, all of this comes under the realm of speculation and the outside context problem of essentially we don't know what we don't know. Maybe some ant-like species could have evolved to expand beyond their planet, but in the end, not be that different from our own ants in their goals, with little value or thought of other individual life or personal freedoms, and a desire to simply take over other planets to expand their hive colony and resource base. But whatever the case there, their primary motivations for coming to Earth really could be dumbed down to three things: to study us from afar, to take our planet or resources for themselves, or to peacefully coexist with us. As for option one of studying us, not unlike anthropologists study various human societies, present and historical, this wouldn't be too surprising. Curiosity and the desire for exploration being rather good evolutionary traits to help a species evolve and progress their science and technology to the point of traveling the stars. Certainly not the only reason to pursue such, but it wouldn't be surprising if aliens who come a-calling share this trait with us as well. If studying us was their sole reason for coming, there would be little need to tell us about their existence, and even potentially efforts would be taken to make sure we didn't find out, so as not to contaminate what they're studying. In this case, an alien invasion would probably be in the form of small, clandestine robotic probes, maybe the occasional abduction with memory wipe upon return, if returned at all, or even taking some of our dead for study. And otherwise, just monitoring all our transmissions from afar, as well as tapping into our internet to easily study basically everything about us and our planet. Nothing really, in this case, for any government of the world to do, even if they knew it was happening. There'd really be no defense against it outside of switching internet captures from making you assert you aren't a robot to instead always going with the alternate, are you human, and then really hoping those aliens have evolved to be unable to assert a lie. Because the adversary in this case would simply be out of our reach, other than we might be able to stop their probes if we could detect them. The second form of invasion would likely come in the form of peaceful contact, perhaps an alien civilization essentially just wanting to add us to some sort of intergalactic coalition of intelligent beings or get to know us more directly. Further, there are always scenarios in which they might even be a ragtag group of alien refugee ships simply trying to find a new home but having no real ability or desire to conquer us, thus posing no intentional threat to us and just wanting to coexist or stop off for some supplies, perhaps in trade for technology. Thus, it is likely such a contact would be a good thing, even if we rejected their advancements and they left. Either way, this would probably unite humans across nations in a way we've never seen before. Also giving us a sense of what is possible from alien craft and the like that we get a glimpse of, even if they aren't sharing their technology, spurring scientists and engineers to figure it all out. And once again, given we now know aliens are out there and know for sure they know where we are, this would likely spur the governments of the world to fund the crap out of such research. On top of this, the world's youth would probably want to join in on the fun, studying science and engineering en masse, with likely government funding also being disproportionately thrown at promoting such in education systems from that point. In short, the governments of the world's plan and reaction will probably be closer ties, less pointless wars, and a massive increase in redirection of funding into advancements in science and engineering, all spurring on another age of exploration, this time focused squarely on space. And this brings us to the final main tier scenario, an alien invasion to take our planet for habitation or for its resources. Now first, let's talk about resources. Them coming for this seems extremely unlikely. Most of the resources that can be found on Earth can be found elsewhere in asteroids, gas giants, etc. These don't have pesky life forms getting in their way. And not only that, many of these sources are much richer in certain staple resources, and it's easier to access things like metals from them. For example, most of the metal on Earth is rather difficult to get at comparatively and rather limited. Or perhaps they want water. Well, Jupiter's moon Europa, despite being only around the size of our moon, is thought to have more water than Earth. Let alone getting those resources off planet could potentially be more difficult given Earth's gravity versus these other celestial bodies like Europa or asteroids. Thus, choosing Earth to mine resources from, at least for a species well versed in living the spacefaring life, seems pretty dumb. If they were really coming to us for resources, an alien invasion of our solar system would probably see them far more interested in other celestial bodies orbiting our sun. They might even ignore us completely. Now all of this requires them to do the work, and thus you might think they'd like to enslave us to do the work of mining our resources for them. So that's why they'd pick Earth. But this also doesn't make a ton of sense, given if they are advanced enough for such space travel, it's likely they have some pretty sophisticated robots and AI to do that for them, without the need to deal with continually rebellious humans who don't enjoy being enslaved. After all, we humans only first started harnessing electricity in practical ways a little over a century ago, and we're already closing in on making such robots that can do anything we can do, and likely will get there within the next century. Thus, human enslavement for labor purposes seems rather pointless, and they'd need to expend an awful lot of resources to make that happen anyway, as well as to maintain it after the fact, either risking their robot armies or even potentially their own lives to do it. Certainly, getting resources from us might be viable if they came in peace and simply wanted to trade with us. But we've moved past that talking point to Hollywood-style invasion here. This now finally brings us to how they would probably invade, what strategy we should use to fight them off, and why there is nothing really we could likely do to stop them, no matter if our weapons can kill them or not. First, it is likely any invasion would not even be known by us until the war was already lost. Why send valuable alien lives to risk in fighting us when they could just send a probe to gather our medical databases via the internet, or potentially even snag some humans for themselves? They'd then simply study our biology and figure out the most effective way to kill us with some substance or engineered virus that also would not harm anything on our planet that they wanted to continue to live, nor harm themselves, or anything they wanted to repopulate the Earth with after we're gone. After all, such a thing isn't that far off for humans' current capabilities if we so choose. And we only discovered viruses a little over a century ago, so it seems likely they'd have this sort of ability, assuming they had viruses on their home planet to be familiar with the concept or have studied us and our technology enough before invading. But even if they have no clue about viruses to even think of such an idea, there are plenty of substances that will kill us right dead that may not harm them at all, and they'd almost certainly be familiar with a concept like that. Either way, they thus then release said substance or virus into our atmosphere en masse, rinse and repeat as necessary until all the humans are dead, planet sanitized of any life forms they didn't want, and they move in. Absolutely nothing much that humans could do about that. And again, we probably wouldn't even realize what was happening or why. If they really wanted to screw with us or didn't have the resources to cover the whole planet, they'd only blanket certain regions with said murderous substance and then spread some rumors it was another nation or nations doing it, and then just watch as we destroy ourselves. On top of that, they might not even need to go to any such complicated measures to sanitize the planet to their liking. For example, if we took a look at Jupiter's moon Europa, it receives daily about 1,800 times the average annual dose of ionizing radiation exposure as the surface of the Earth does. For reference, with that kind of exposure, about half of all humans would be dead in 1 month alone. Further, it has been theorized that due to its rather likely large ocean under that ice layer it has and oxygen levels there, combined with the age of this moon, it may well be teeming with life. Granted, ice is a reasonably good insulator against ionizing radiation, but the point is, it is entirely possible for life forms to develop and evolve in the presence of huge amounts of ionizing radiation that would drop us Earthlings rapidly. Thus, bathing the Earth in such ionizing radiation may be an effective way of sanitizing the planet before they introduce themselves, and perhaps many species and life forms from their home world. It's also entirely possible that not just the first wave being robots, but rather their entire civilization might be at that point, with the biological robot creators having died or been killed off at some point before. meaning, once again, a variety of Earth biological lifeform sanitization methods may be available to their robotic selves, all without stepping foot on the planet or worrying about the effects of such sanitation methods on themselves. As a brief aside, going back to Europa, also interesting to point out is that it's technically even possible there is not only life, but intelligent life in our own solar system. In this case, perhaps just not intelligent enough, or maybe with no desire to drill through the seeming tens of kilometers thick ice shell that moon has. In that case, at least, it's presumably one alien species we could defeat. But maybe better just to make friends. After all, we're neighbors. Although given what deep-sea creatures look like on Earth, let's just say that might be a bit of a barrier in terms of us accepting they aren't out to devour our bones. It's a PR problem, really. In any event, going back to Earth sanitization methods, if they didn't mind altering our atmosphere a bit, again depending on their biology or terraforming abilities, they may not care, they could potentially just chuck asteroids at our cities, or just in general at the planet, until we humans are a non-factor. And there's little that we could effectively do about that either. Or at least not for long. Some space agencies obviously are looking into defending against asteroids headed our way, but we aren't there yet. Or why not just orbit the Earth and use their own missiles or lasers to systematically wipe out all of our defenses, cities, supply depots, etc., until our population had dwindled from these attacks and starvation to the point of it just being a non-factor. Once again, there's really very little we could do about it because we lack the ability to effectively attack them at their source. Thus, any strategy an intelligent conquering species would use would probably leverage the crap out of that advantage in any and every way possible before bothering to come within a sphere we could actually touch them in. That said, if none of those options were something they could or would want to do, perhaps their species has some sort of heightened sense of honor and fair play, or otherwise desire to fight more directly when asserting dominance, the next invasion step would be sending in robots or otherwise coming in person. This one, at least the governments of the world could have something to do, but it probably wouldn't matter long term. We'd still be fighting an enemy we couldn't really touch at their ultimate source. But let's not go quietly into the night, so what would our best strategy be once we see them coming? First, if we see them coming, while some suggest launching nukes at them while they are still in space, this would seemingly be ineffective. Their ships would probably be capable of simply maneuvering out of the way to a level our missiles would not be able to adequately compensate for. Or they could just destroy them with their own weapons before they impacted. Second, just because we see them coming doesn't mean they aren't coming in peace. All initial efforts should be from the stance of anything to not actually fight. Thus, initial efforts should be to attempt to contact them in any way possible and listen to whether they're trying to contact us. In the meantime, best to prepare those nukes for more Earth-based attacks. Start making those worldwide treaties and establishing some sort of decision-making body and working on military coordination, etc. Many things, by the way, that could have been thought out in advance, like now, relatively effectively. As we're doing that, we should start stockpiling supplies of all sorts and rapidly recruiting literally anyone to the military who wants to join and giving them a crash course in weaponry usage and fighting tactics, but otherwise just observing their approach and doing nothing to potentially provoke a warlike response. Make them fire the first shot before responding in kind, just in case they come in peace. That said, if we are 100% sure they do have hostile intent, for example, if they broadcast a message like, "Prepare to die," and assuming this wasn't just some practical joke from their leader Grabthar with his galactically well-known sense of humor concerning first contact scenarios, we'd have to make some quick decisions about our artificial satellites, and start making any and all preparations to stop relying on them, which may be even more than most of us realize. For example, the GPS system alone isn't just useful for navigation, but pretty much mission critical for a variety of technologies, owing to its extreme accuracy in timekeeping, about plus or minus 10 billionths of a second. This has been used by countless businesses the world over for everything from aiding in power grid management to use in making cell networks work properly, to helping manage the stock market and other banking institutions, to server synchronization worldwide, etc., etc. The GPS system essentially allows for companies to have near atomic clock level precision in their systems, including easy time synchronization across the globe, without actually needing to have an atomic clock or come up with their own systems for global synchronization. Because of this and its cheapness to utilize, an incredible number of world-critical systems rely on it. And once the aliens arrive, given how much we rely on satellites for so many things, if they really were interested in invading in such a way that they or their robots actually might fight us, taking out our satellites would be a pretty smart and easy thing to do. Or at least presumably they could do it in such a way as not to cause high-speed debris to fly all about to make it difficult for them to enter our atmosphere, which may or may not be a concern for them. Either way, taking out our satellites without damaging them physically would likely be relatively trivial, as illustrated by a rather humorous 1960s era whoopsie-doodle when the US accidentally killed 1/3 of all satellites in orbit. How did they do it? Well, they detonated a 1.4 megaton nuclear weapon named Starfish Prime in the upper atmosphere as part of Project Fishbowl. Even satellites on the other side of the planet at the time, like Britain's first satellite, the Ariel 1, which had only weeks before been put into orbit, were rendered inoperable. As to why, the explosion sent a wave of additional radiation around the Earth that ultimately damaged some of the systems on Ariel 1, particularly its solar panels, ultimately killing it, and, once again, about 1/3 of the rest of the satellites in low Earth orbit at the time. Now, if you're wondering about the purpose of the Starfish Prime explosion, according to James Fleming, a history professor who combed through previously top-secret files and recordings concerning the blast, the US military were working with scientist James Van Allen to see if nuclear explosions could influence the existing belts of radiation around the Earth. Van Allen apparently started working with the US military to launch nukes into these belts the very same day he announced to the world that it discovered the belts, now known as the Van Allen radiation belts. Fleming noted of this is the first occasion I've ever discovered where someone discovered something and immediately decided to blow it up. He forgot to mention the obligatory for science, though. Needless to say, making our satellites useless to us without making an immediate problem at a giant debris field would probably be pretty trivial. On this note, it has been suggested that if we know the aliens are enemies, it might be prudent for us to destroy all of our satellites ourselves, making a massive high-speed debris field for them to have to fly through if they want to come down and say hi. However, in this initial stage where we don't know their capabilities, potentially whether they are even an enemy or not, and given those satellites are pretty incredibly useful for as long as we can keep them, this intentional destruction would seem rather imprudent until we know more. Later, if they've disabled our satellites and we find their ships are vulnerable to high-speed orbiting debris, then such destruction en masse, in whatever way we can do it, would be one defensive step we could take. But either way, we'd definitely want to be coming up with any and every way to implement alternate methods for doing much of what our satellites do in case they got taken out. And this brings us to the ground invasion, which, again, probably wouldn't happen until we humans were either wiped out or effectively crippled. But let's assume, by some stroke of luck, their commanders are dumb, despite seemingly being a species bent on galactic conquest, so well, they'd probably be pretty experienced. As to the actual invasion, once again, the idea that our weapons would be totally ineffective seems to be giving the aliens too much credit, as we previously noted. At the end of the day, physics is going to physics, and there's no way around it. Sure, their understanding and utilization of it may or may not be far superior to our own, but if they are going to ever be walking around and living on the surface, there's an awful lot we could do to them. After all, many a massively overmatched society has successfully repulsed their drastically superior foe using some tried and true methods. And last time I checked, Will Smith punched one of them in the face, and it was totally effective. And he's just an actor. Imagine what Jocko Willink could do to them. But this is where the real plan starts to take shape. In this, once again, full-on invasion, definitely trying to wipe us out scenario, it is likely the aliens, having no doubt studied us first, would have an overwhelmingly winning strategy in their blitzkrieg. Thus, any initial attempts at repulsing them are likely to be ineffective. That's not to say we shouldn't try. Maybe they are Packlets come for a visit. But more likely, we'd lose handily in these initial skirmishes. But at least we'd gain an incredible amount of the first data that we need to eventually put up a real defense, assessing what their capabilities are and how effective our weapons are against them. On this one, it would probably be a good idea to keep most of our likely soon-to-be very difficult to replace forces and equipment back while we observe the first wave. If we're faring well, then it doesn't seem they're just letting us win to draw out the rest of our forces, then, well, throw everything at them. If it's more like the initial air battles in Independence Day, it's best to execute stage 2 of the plan. Everything they've got and a massive amount of supplies, and hide in pockets all over the place. As the rest of us humans, what to do at this point would really depend on what the aliens do. If they seem intent on wiping out major cities or the like, then running for the hills and remote areas may not be the worst idea in the world. But if they simply take a region, which by the way could even just be our oceans if they are sea creatures, and begin expanding out that way, keeping industries, particularly staple ones like anything related to food, etc., going for as long as possible would be ideal. All of us starving or dying of exposure would also be a great way for the aliens to wipe us out more easily if we had such a mass panic response. Now, going back to the militaries and general strategy, the point of all of this is making the conflict long and drawn out and as resource expensive as possible for the aliens. Much like many a weaker nation in modern times has successfully overcome the extreme and hugely lopsided might of an opposing nation via guerrilla warfare tactics, this is exactly what the governments of the world should do. As noted by authors of An Introduction to Planetary Defense, Travis Taylor and Bob Bone, you'd have to create an insurgency, a Mujahideen-type resistance. The insurgents know how to win this war against us. It also tells us that if we were attacked by aliens, this is our best defense. Thus, never truly engage, but hide, harass, delay, destroy, or capture any supplies and equipment sent by the aliens, and when they actually come themselves, make life miserable for them in every way possible. This may potentially be extremely effective, given it's entirely possible the aliens can't just pop back home for resupply, and in some sense, for many staples, we humans may be even better supplied than them initially, just needing to steal and adapt their technology and learn all about them and their weaknesses while we do it. If we're really lucky, whatever technology the aliens use to get here is such that it takes years to decades or even centuries to send more. On the lower end, perhaps buying us some time to assimilate their technology, and on the higher end, potentially giving us plenty of time if we manage to thwart that first wave. Although sending such a wave without a definite probability of success, or not having it followed pretty quickly by their peoples to come populate our planet, would be a rather odd move, so possibly we'd not get that much time. But either way, our strategy would be the same here. On that note of capturing supplies, as alluded to, in the meantime, we should have our scientists and engineers of the world studying the crap out of all of this and their probable robot army, trying to level up our own technologies and finding weaknesses in theirs, ultimately, hopefully bringing our technology on par with theirs before they manage to wipe us out. In parallel, we should also, if we actually get to the point where any of them come in the flesh, if they aren't just a robot society, be studying their biology and attempting to come up with a virus or substance of our own that we can use to wipe them out, similar to what they really should have done to us in the first place if they were smart. And even if they are all robots, there may be a type of computer virus or other way to simply shut them all off that's available to us with enough study. Of course, they'd then have the ability to temporarily leave if they wanted, and we were starting to win, and then now that we gave them such an idea, do something similar to us. This once again brings us back to the huge problem and why we'd probably still lose. All of this is pointless unless we can actually attack them at their source, as outside of them just losing interest in taking our planet at that point, there's really no way to stop the attacks long term without this ability. And so whether it takes a week or a century, we humans are doomed. Thus, another priority in capturing their supplies and technology would be the capture of some of their ships and reverse engineering them. If we got that far, and if we could manufacture some ships of our own, the strategy should probably be to assess how well our tactics are faring and if there was any hope of victory at this stage. If so, first, anyone who wants to stay and keep fighting remains to continue making our alien conquerors' lives miserable. Second, we should be gathering up the remaining humans and leave, if possible, to search the stars for another home. Given we at some point had some of their ships and successfully reverse engineered them, presumably would also at this point have their star maps, which hopefully would give us a clue as to where to start looking for a new home planet. And now, with well-upgraded technology more on par with our alien conquerors, perhaps in the ensuing centuries, hiding away somewhere in the stars and rebuilding our civilization, where we'd be able to advance to a level where we could finally beat them. Or if we ended up deciding to leave no humans behind as the war was almost lost, another possibility upon leaving would be the age-old scorched earth approach, in this case, scorching Earth, perhaps nuking the crap out of the planet on our way out, or similar in an attempt to make it uninhabitable, at least in the immediate. This could also potentially be an okay initial strategy for victory if upon learning all about our alien overlords, we found we could survive such better than they could. But this one doesn't seem like the best plan if we intend to stay, but as a last, because you, that's why, to our alien conquerors, I mean, why not? Later, we could potentially come back once we leveled up our society in all sorts of ways on another planet or multiple planets, and Earth had time to heal itself a bit from whatever we did to it. Of course, this would depend on the exact technology used to travel the stars and how fast. Should it be something that takes centuries to get anywhere, while it still may be our only hope of long-term survival, leaving may be a last resort, and with ever returning perhaps being off the table. But listen, nobody said this was going to be easy. In fact, we stated several times that in all likelihood there is a zero chance we humans could survive an alien invasion. First, because any attack on us would likely be in the form of just wiping us out from afar before potentially we even knew they were coming. And second, even if they did want to attack us more directly, they have the ultimate trump card in that we can't attack them at their source. Thus, it's really only a matter of time until they win, unless we simply make the effort too resource and time intensive for them and they decide to just abandon the effort. Somewhat similar to how the terrorists that were the traitors to the British Crown in the Americas centuries ago won when they rebelled against the vastly superior British Empire. But to sum up, it is perhaps unsurprising from all of this that the governments of the world seem to have no real plan if aliens invade. First, because any defense would likely be an effort in futility, and second, because even if by some miracle it wasn't, we can't really predict anything about what technologies might be brought to bear. We simply don't know what we don't know, other than we'd almost certainly be doomed if the aliens decided to take the planet from us. On that note, I for one welcome our new alien overlords, and I'd like to point out to them that as a trusted YouTube personality, I can be helpful in rounding up others to toil in your underground sugar caves or whatever. On July the 6th, 1947, Foreman William Brazier was patrolling the Foster cattle ranch 50 kilometers outside of the town of Roswell, New Mexico, when he noticed some strange debris strewn around the grounds. The debris was composed of a strange, silvery, metallic substance, parts of which were covered in strings of mysterious symbols resembling Egyptian hieroglyphs. The following day, Brazier contacted the nearby Roswell Army Airfield, who immediately dispatched a team to inspect and recover the debris. On July the 8th, Walter Hout, the airfield's public information officer, issued a press release announcing that the Army Air Force had recovered a flying disc from a nearby ranch. This statement was quickly retracted and replaced with another explaining that the debris was merely the remains of a weather beacon. But it was too late. The announcement was quickly picked up by multiple news outlets and spread like wildfire around the country, touching off a cultural obsession with flying saucers, alien visitations, and government cover-ups that persists to this day. But while UFO skeptics are quick to point out that the Roswell flying saucer was merely a weather balloon, the truth of the matter is actually far more interesting. For the debris that fell on Foster Ranch that July day in 1947 was, in fact, part of a top-secret Air Force effort to spy on the Soviet Union using high-altitude balloons. As we covered in our previous video, the Aerostatic Corps, the world's first military air force, balloons have a long and illustrious military history stretching all the way back to the wars of the French Revolution, when they were used to direct the movement of soldiers and artillery on the battlefield. Balloons continued to be used for battlefield reconnaissance until the end of the First World War, when this role was taken over by, well, more capable aircraft. However, balloons saw similar use during the Second World War as offensive weapons, particularly by Imperial Japan. Lacking long-range bomber aircraft with which to attack the mainland United States, the Japanese instead turned to high-altitude balloons. Known as Fugo, these weapons consisted of a 10-meter diameter mulberry paper envelope filled with hydrogen, below which were suspended various high-explosive and incendiary bombs. Launched from Japan, the Fugo rose to an altitude of 9,100 meters and were carried 8,000 kilometers across the Pacific Ocean by the high-altitude jet stream. After 3 days, a timer ignited a flash bomb to destroy the envelope, dropping the payload onto the target. As the hydrogen in the envelope would expand during the day and contract at night, causing the balloon's altitude to fluctuate, the weapons carried a simple but effective altitude control system that automatically released ballast if the balloon sank too low and vented hydrogen from the envelope if it rose too high. Though aiming at specific targets was impossible, the balloons were intended to spread terror and ignite forest fires in the Pacific Northwest, depleting strategically vital stocks of timber. More than 9,000 Fugo were launched between November 1944 and April 1945, but due to unpredictable weather over the Pacific, only around 10% made it to North America, causing negligible damage and killing 6 picnickers near Bly, Oregon on the 5th of May 1945. But while the Fugo offensive was a dismal strategic failure, the balloon's ability to maintain their altitude over great distances was noted with great interest by US intelligence and would prove very useful in the immediate post-war years. In the late 1940s, the United States and the Western world faced an ever-escalating series of international crises. In 1946 and 1947, communist governments took over Hungary and Poland. In 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded Berlin. And in 1949, Mao Zedong's communists won the Chinese Civil War, and the Soviets tested their own atomic bomb years ahead of Western predictions. To counter this mounting communist threat, the US government needed reliable intelligence from behind the Iron Curtain. This was definitely easier said than done. The Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China were closed societies, making the infiltration of human spies almost impossible. And while US Air Force aircraft regularly flew reconnaissance missions along the borders of the Soviet Union and its satellite states, none dared cross into Soviet territory for fear of being shot down and setting off a international crisis. So, faced with a veritable black hole of information regarding Soviet military and nuclear capabilities, the US Army Air Force, like the Japanese before them, turned to high-altitude balloons as a possible solution. Unmanned balloons could rise to altitudes of up to 30,500 meters, far beyond the range of Soviet interceptor aircraft and missiles, and if fitted with the same altitude control system that the Japanese Fugo had, they could theoretically ride the jet stream across the entire of the Soviet Union, taking pictures as they went. Fortuitously, the technology that could make this possible had just recently been developed by a rather unexpected organization. Though best known as the manufacturers of breakfast cereals like Cheerios, Cocoa Puffs, and Lucky Charms, The General Mills Corporation of Minneapolis, Minnesota, was at one point a major innovator in aerospace technology, especially high-altitude scientific balloons. The Aeronautical Research Division of General Mills was established in 1946 and placed under the direction of émigré German engineer Otto Vinzen. The division soon began working closely with the US Navy's Office of Naval Research, or ONR, which was seeking a means of sending scientific payloads to extremely high altitudes to study high-altitude winds, cosmic rays, and other natural phenomena. At first, the ONR used long chains of traditional latex weather balloons, but these proved prone to leaking and bursting at high altitudes. Seeking an alternative, Vinzen and his team at General Mills soon hit upon polyethylene, the same plastic used in sandwich bags. Lightweight, strong, and resistant to ultraviolet light, polyethylene could be fashioned into balloons only 0.025 millimeters thick and up to 30 meters in diameter that would not leak or tear, and could maintain a constant altitude for weeks on end. The first of these balloons, codenamed Skyhook, was launched on the 25th of September 1947, carrying a cosmic ray detector to an altitude of 30,000 meters. The Skyhook balloons proved extremely successful, and over the following decade, more than 1,500 would be launched by the ONR from locations in the US and Canada and ships in the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans, carrying a wide range of scientific payloads, including automatic cameras for photographing solar eclipses and sunspots, film-based and Cherenkov detectors for detecting cosmic rays, and even balloon-launched sounding rockets called Raccoons. In 1949, Vinzen left General Mills to found his own company, Vinzen Research Inc., which continued to provide a range of successful scientific balloons until Vinzen's death by suicide in 1979. Vinzen's Skyhook balloons were exactly what the US Army Air Force needed for its planned reconnaissance overflights, codenamed Project Mogul. Mogul was based on a curious scientific phenomenon discovered during the Second World War. In 1944, American geophysicist Maurice Ewing discovered that at a certain depth below the ocean, the effects of pressure and temperature combine to create a zone of water in which the speed of sound is at a minimum. Any sound produced in this zone will thus bounce off the layers of water above and below, allowing it to propagate over long distances. Indeed, whales and other marine creatures are now known to use this zone, which Ewing dubbed the sound fixing and ranging, or SOFAR channel, to communicate across entire oceans. Ewing used this discovery to create a device called a SOFAR bomb to allow Navy pilots downed at sea to secretly communicate their position without alerting the enemy. Consisting of a small hollow metal sphere packed in a pilot's survival kit, when dropped in the water, the bomb would sink down to the SOFAR channel and implode, creating a signal that could be detected and triangulated by shore-based hydrophones. After the war, it was realized that a similar sound channel existed in the upper atmosphere, and that by flying balloons equipped with instruments into this channel, the sounds of distant enemy nuclear tests and missile launches could be detected. To this end, Mogul balloons were fitted with ultra-sensitive microphones, telemetry systems for transmitting recorded data to ground stations, and automatic systems for maintaining the balloon's altitude. To disguise the true nature of the project, during testing, the Mogul equipment was fitted to unclassified weather balloons designed and launched by a research team from New York University. Mogul Flight Number 4, launched on June the 4th, 1947, is almost certainly the object which fell onto Foster Ranch outside Roswell 1 month later. To allow these balloons to be tracked, NYU researchers fitted them with a chain of kite-shaped radar reflectors consisting of lightweight balsa wood frames covered in metal foil. According to Charles B. Moore, a General Mills engineer attached to Project Mogul, the foil was fixed to the frames using metallic tape purchased from a New York City toy factory. This tape was stamped with decorative patterns including hearts and flowers intended to appeal to children, and it was these figures which ufologists later mistook for alien hieroglyphics. But Mogul Number 4 would not be the last weather balloon to be mistaken for an alien spacecraft. On January the 7th, 1948, Godman Army Airfield at Fort Knox, Kentucky, received a report from a highway patrolman of an unusual object floating in the sky over the town of Madisonville. The object, described as round, bright white, and with a red border around its base, was soon spotted several kilometers west, traveling at an estimated altitude of 3,000 meters and a speed of 800 kilometers an hour. A flight of 4 F-51D Mustang fighters of the Kentucky National Guard were ordered to intercept. One pilot, already low on fuel, immediately returned to base, but the 3 others pursued the object at an altitude of 6,900 meters. Not having any oxygen masks, 2 more pilots abandoned the chase, but the third, 25-year-old Captain Thomas F. Mantell, Mill continued to climb after the object until at an altitude of 7,600 meters he blacked out from lack of oxygen. Mantel's aircraft spiraled to the ground, killing him on impact. 10 months later, on October 1st, 1948, Lieutenant George F. Gorman of the North Dakota National Guard reported intercepting a similar fast-moving glowing sphere while flying an F-51D over Fargo. In both cases, the objects were later revealed to be skyhook research balloons. These encounters are considered among the first classic UFO sightings that cemented the idea of alien encounters in the American consciousness, though in both cases the mysterious objects were later revealed to be skyhook balloons. In the end, Project Mogul was never operationally deployed, but it laid the groundwork for future, more sophisticated Air Force balloon projects. In July 1950, General Mills conducted a series of 4 skyhook demonstration flights carrying aerial observation cameras, prompting the Air Force to launch an official balloon reconnaissance program under the code name Gopher. As with Mogul, Gopher was conducted using the cover of an unclassified atmospheric research project, in this case, Project Moby Dick. The Gopher gondola carried a 225-kilogram payload consisting of a narrow-angle camera that took pictures every 6.5 minutes and a wide-angle panoramic camera to determine the general geographic location of the balloon. The balloons could remain at an altitude of 21,000 meters for up to 16 days, whereupon the gondola would detach and deploy a parachute. On test flights, the payloads parachuted to the grounds, but on operational flights, they were snatched mid-air by specially equipped Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar transport aircraft before they could fall into enemy hands. While Gopher was intended to become operational by the end of 1951, the project suffered a number of delays due to issues with the camera payload and the mid-air recovery system. These problems led to many test balloons drifting wildly off course and being lost in remote, unpopulated areas. One such balloon launched in 1955 from Lowry Air Force Base in Colorado came down in a forest in New Brunswick, Canada, where it was discovered by a woodsman in 1962. The highly classified payload was quickly snapped up by the Canadian military, leaving an enduring local mystery that was not solved until the US Air Force files were declassified in 2016. Project Gopher went through a series of upgrades and redesignations, being renamed Project Grandson, Project Greyback, and finally Project Genetrix. Finally, in late 1955, President Dwight Eisenhower gave the go-ahead for the Air Force to begin overflights of the Soviet Union in January of the following year, provided the balloons were limited to altitudes below 16,800 meters. This was because Lockheed's U-2 spy plane was then currently in development, and Eisenhower did not wish to give the Soviets any excuse to develop fighter aircraft and missiles capable of intercepting this higher-flying aircraft. To provide a cover story for the Genetrix launches, the Air Force created an unclassified atmospheric research project called Operation White Cloud. Between January the 10th and February the 6th, 1956, 338 Genetrix balloons were launched from sites in Scotland, Norway, Germany, and Turkey, while 30 White Cloud balloons were launched from Hawaii, Okinawa, and Alaska. Of these, more than 300 came down prematurely over Soviet territory due to equipment malfunctions or were shot down by Soviet pilots who quickly learned to intercept the balloons in the early morning when, due to lower night temperatures, they descended to lower altitudes. Many balloons successfully reached their recovery zones, but could not be retrieved due to bad weather and other factors. In the end, only 44 payloads were successfully recovered, and their photos only covered around 8% of the Soviet and Chinese landmasses. Furthermore, as the balloons couldn't be steered towards strategic targets, the vast majority of these photos were of limited strategic value. Worse still, Genetrix proved a public relations disaster, with the Soviet Union and its client states angrily protesting the flagrant violation of their airspace. The Air Force therefore swiftly cancelled Genetrix in favor of the CIA's new, more capable U-2 spy plane. However, Genetrix was not a complete failure. The cameras developed for the project would form the basis for later, more sophisticated photo reconnaissance systems, while the mid-air recovery system would later be used to great success to retrieve film capsules from Corona spy satellites. The balloon flights also generated data on high-altitude winds that proved useful to the U-2 overflight program. A more unexpected benefit of the program was that the steel bar that secured the gondola ballasting system happened to measure 91 centimeters, exactly the wavelength of a Soviet radar system codenamed Token. This caused the bar to resonate when hit by Token radar pulses, allowing the CIA to locate previously unknown radar installations and divert U-2 flights around them. But perhaps the strangest legacy of Genetrix systems stemmed from the fact that so many of the balloons and their payloads were captured by the Soviets. Soviet scientists quickly realized that the temperature and radiation-resistant film developed for the balloon cameras was ideal for use in outer space, and on October 7, 1959, captured Genetrix film aboard the Soviet Luna 3 probe was used to take the first ever pictures of the far side of the moon. In addition to Genetrix, the Air Force also ran Project Ashcan, which used skyhook balloons to sample the air above the Soviet Union for fallout from nuclear weapons tests and nuclear reactors, the latter of which allowed US intelligence to estimate how much plutonium the Soviets were producing. The Air Force even developed the balloon-based WS-124A Flying Cloud platform as a means of delivering nuclear and biological weapons to targets within the Soviet Union. However, by the 1960s, all such projects had been cancelled as manned aircraft, missiles, and satellites proved far more effective than balloons in nearly every military role. The heyday of projects like Mogul and Genetrix was a unique period in military history when surveillance technology had not yet caught up to the complex strategic realities of the Cold War. It was also a time of extreme secrecy and paranoia, which furnished a fertile breeding ground for wild speculation and conspiracy theories that endure to this day. While the early UFO sightings of the 1940s and 50s were almost certainly the product of top-secret Air Force spy balloons, the jury remains out on whether we are, in fact, alone in the universe. But as a wise man once said, the truth is out there.
We here at Today I Found Out are firmly in the camp that language is constantly evolving and grammar lives to serve language and effective communication, not the other way around. Putting aside the issue of unintentional mistakes, intentional use of atypical grammar isn't really something to get inherently upset or high and mighty about. And certainly those who claim that some words like irregardless aren't actually words are never correct. All words are words from the moment someone first coins them, at least according to pretty much every major dictionary editor out there. If you want to learn more about that, I'd definitely recommend checking out our video, How Do They Decide What Words Go in the Dictionary and Are Words Ever Removed? On a similar note, if many people want to treat UFO as an initialism instead of an acronym and thus say UFO when they see that string of letters, in our opinion, one is on shaky ground if claiming that we've all been pronouncing it wrong. That said, it is very interesting to note how pronunciations sometimes diverge from what the original creators or people who popularized some term intended. For example, Dr. Seuss should actually be pronounced Dr. Seuss, but Theodore Geisel got tired of correcting people, so we all now say Dr. Seuss instead of how Dr. Seuss initially intended. Similarly, Wikipedia should technically be pronounced Wikipedia, not Wikipedia, if we're going to follow the lead of the original creator of the first wiki, Ward Cunningham, when he first applied the Hawaiian word wiki, meaning quick, to his bit of web software, the WikiWeb. This brings us to the man of the hour, Edward J. Ruppelt, who died at the tender age of 37 from a heart attack. His name is mostly only remembered today by those well-versed in the field of ufology. As to why said individuals are familiar with this man, this is largely because of his genuinely fascinating book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, which drew from his admirable work on Project Blue Book, a comprehensive set of investigations conducted by the US Air Force into the phenomenon of flying saucers. While working on the project, Ruppelt famously suggested the phrase unidentified flying object to describe these sightings, rather than flying saucer, as was previously popular among the general public. He then shortened this to the three letters U, F, and O, and even instructed people on how this should be spoken. Now, of course, we at Today I Found Out could tell you that now, but as we've written a lot of interesting things about early government research into potential extraterrestrial unidentified flying objects, and that the YouTube algorithmic gods have deemed they'll promote videos more where people watch longer into the videos, we should probably wait for the reveal until later to make sure you keep watching. Or if you promise to keep watching, we could not be dicks about it and tell you right now. So do you promise you'll keep watching? Well, okay then, how you pronounce it is UFO. UFO is how the person who popularized and is sometimes credited as coining unidentified flying object instructed people to say the acronym version of the words. Now remember that promise you made, and do remember that lies make baby Jesus cry, and watch on. Born in 1923, Ruppelt was a distinguished airman, including earning 2 theater combat ribbons, 5 battle stars, 3 air medals, and 2 distinguished flying crosses during World War II. Following the war, Ruppelt attended college and earned a degree in aeronautical engineering, occasionally flying as a navigator with the Air Force Reserves to maintain his status as an airman. Following his graduation in 1951, with the Korean War ongoing, Captain Ruppelt returned to active duty, though this time being assigned to the Air Technical Intelligence Center, ATIC, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio. As Ruppelt would later casually note in his aforementioned book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, in addition to keeping tabs on foreign aircraft and missiles, the ATIC also had the UFO project. Initially, it was Ruppelt's job to review reports on flying saucers, as they were then called, and present his findings to the Pentagon. You see, since at least 1947, the US government had been studying reports of flying saucers as part of Project Sign, and later Project Grudge. The original intended goal of each of these projects was to discern, first, whether any reports of flying saucers were credible, and second, whether they represented a threat to the United States. The problem was that both Sign and Grudge came at the issue from a rather biased perspective. Ruppelt himself would criticize both projects for being overly politicized, noting of these investigations, "In doing this, standard intelligence procedures normally means an unbiased evaluation of intelligence data, but it doesn't take a great deal of study of the old UFO files to see that standard intelligence procedures were not being followed by Project Grudge. Everything was being evaluated on the premise that UFOs couldn't exist. No matter what you see or hear, don't believe it." On top of this, it was eventually discovered by military brass, most notably General Charles Cabell, that those working on Project Grudge weren't actually investigating the reports coming in that they claimed they were investigating. Instead, in many cases, they were simply coming up with debunking explanations off the top of their heads, regardless of how tenuous their explanations were. According to Ruppelt, the advent of more sophisticated radar technology and certain seemingly credible reports of UFOs throughout the early 1950s are what eventually encouraged said high-ranking government officials to deem the phenomenon worthy of actual rigorous study. In his words, airline pilots, military pilots, generals, scientists, and dozens of other people were reporting UFOs, and in greater detail than in reports of the past. Radars, which were being built for air defense, began to pick up some very unusual targets, thus lending technical corroboration to the unsubstantiated claims of human observers. As a result of the continuing accumulation of more impressive UFO reports, official interest stirred. And this, finally, is where Ruppelt got his chance to shine. Chosen to head up the successor to Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, Ruppelt was handpicked for his reputation as a gifted organizer, as well as his known open-mindedness towards the possibility that at least some of the UFO sightings being reported were of genuine extraterrestrial origin. In short, for once, certain military brass wanted the issue to actually be investigated properly to determine if there was any validity to any of it. If there was, the military could then react appropriately, and if not, they could at least show that they'd done their due diligence in debunking the idea. Needless to say, when Ruppelt began Project Blue Book, he was determined that the biases that had thwarted the previous 2 projects looking into the phenomenon of UFOs would not be present. In fact, he even went so far as to dismiss anyone who seemed to demonstrate any bias on either side of the argument. Beyond this, Ruppelt also set about addressing a particular bugbear of his, the term flying saucer. He wrote, "Obviously, the term flying saucer is misleading when applied to objects of every conceivable shape and performance. For this reason, the military prefers the more general, if less colorful, name unidentified flying objects." It was at this point that he suggested the pronunciation of UFO. While he may have popularized, and some claim coined, unidentified flying object and the acronym UFO via his various reports and other writings on the subject, his suggestion on how UFO should be spoken was apparently almost universally ignored by the general public, who instead decided to treat the 3 letters as an initialism when they caught whiff of the acronym in the 1950s. In any event, while at the helm of the project, an era generally referred to by ufologists as the Golden Age of Project Blue Book, Ruppelt lamented the fact that his team was perpetually understaffed. He did, however, note that the Air Force brass gave his team top-secret security clearance, allowing them to interview any military personnel they wanted, regardless of rank, as well as just generally bypass any bureaucratic red tape they might have otherwise encountered while trying to get to the bottom of every reported case of a UFO that came in. Not only this, but each US Air Force base was assigned a Blue Book officer in charge of collecting UFO reports for Ruppelt. After investigating some 4,500 such UFO reports, Ruppelt officially retired from the Air Force and Project Blue Book in 1953, though the project technically continued without him until January of 1970. And if you're interested, you can read some of the now declassified UFO investigations comprising 100,000 plus pages on the National Archives website or at Project Blue Book Archive. Now, as I'm guessing few have the time to read that many thousands of pages, we'll just note that of the 12,618 UFO reports investigated, the vast majority were concluded to be things like sightings of naturally occurring phenomenon or experimental aircraft. As for the exceptions, there were 701 identified flying object reports, about 5%, that remained officially unidentified. Unsurprisingly, given the vast amount of data they collected without a single definitive positive sighting of an extraterrestrial UFO, the conclusion of Project Blue Book was that 1. No UFO reported, investigated, and evaluated by the Air Force has ever given any indication of threat to our national security. 2. There has been no evidence submitted to or discovered by the Air Force that sightings categorized as unidentified represent technological developments or principles beyond the range of present-day scientific knowledge. And 3. There has been no evidence indicating that sightings categorized as unidentified are extraterrestrial vehicles. Ruppelt himself seems to have agreed with these sentiments, writing shortly before his death that while he remained open-minded about potential extraterrestrial UFOs, the thousands of reports to date had investigated personally seemed to demonstrate the idea of extraterrestrial UFOs was, as he put it, a space-age myth. Now, of course, this hasn't stopped ufologists who generally insist that at least some of the unsolved cases totally were extraterrestrial vehicles. You're not fooling anyone with your open mind, access to all government information on UFOs, and rigorous investigative practices, Ruppelt. The truth is out there. Imagine for a moment that it's 40,000 years in the future, in a solar system far, far away, on a planet that's just thriving with intelligent life. Extraterrestrial beings inhabit this place. Perhaps they look like cuddly E.T., the Blob, Alf, or maybe even the dreadlocked beings from Predator, but either way, they are not human. An approaching object catches the aliens' eyes, assuming they have them. Upon sending a craft to retrieve it, they find a probe containing a disc. Using instructions on the disc, they manage to play it. While they are about to hear and see are the sounds and images from an ancient civilization, 1977 Earth. Flashback about 40 millennia to Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, Earth in January of 1977. A brilliant 43-year-old professor named Carl Sagan is the director of the Laboratory of Planetary Studies there. In 1975, he had won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Dragons of Eden, a dissertation on the evolution of human intelligence. He helped to shape the field of exobiology, the study of the potential for life on other planets. Sagan had also been a key advisor for NASA, dating all the way back to its earliest days. Working out of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California as a visiting scientist, he helped design and manage several space exploration missions, including Mariner 2's trip to Venus and Viking 1 and 2's trips to Mars. Also, in the late 1950s, he was involved in a plan that the US had to nuke the moon. So when Dr. Sagan received a call to come to the JPL once again to help NASA, this wasn't out of the ordinary. But this wasn't an ordinary mission. In August of 1977, NASA planned on launching twin unmanned space probes called Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. The probe's original mission was to explore and take pictures of the giants of our solar system, Jupiter, Saturn, plus all of their moons. There was also a hope that if the probe's instruments continued to operate, the probes could do the same with Uranus and Neptune. Due to a rare geometric arrangement of the outer planets that only happens every 175 years, all 4 planets were positioned perfectly so that a probe launched into space at the proper angle, time, and speed would be able to pass all of them. Pluto was never a part of this mission due to it being elsewhere in its orbit and not a part of the geometric arrangement. The probes were built to last 5 years, but there was considerable optimism that has since proved founded that they would last many years more than that. There was also a possible additional mission. If all went as planned and they were able to carry it out, they would be the first Earth crafts to leave our solar system and become interstellar travelers. This is what NASA wanted Dr. Sagan for. In less than 9 months, NASA wanted Dr. Sagan to compile a team and devise a message in case of contact with an extraterrestrial civilization outside of our solar system, a message that needed to convey what life was like on Earth and be relatively easily understood by those who receive it. Now, the chances of the probes ever being found, detected, or recovered by an extraterrestrial civilization are incredibly small. The probes are the size of a small car, which doesn't even register as a blip in the vastness of the universe. For that matter, the entire Milky Way itself is barely a blip on that scale, so that should give you a bit of perspective on this. Additionally, the probes wouldn't even reach another planetary system until around 40,000 years into the future. At that point, Voyager 1 will be nearing Gliese 445, and Voyager 2 will be close to Ross 248. Nevertheless, it was decided such a message should be included, just in case. The decision was made pretty early on that whatever was sent up there needed to showcase Earth, the sights and sounds of our home planet. It had to be a cultural Noah's Ark with a shelf life of hundreds of millions of years. Now the question was, well, what sights and sounds did we want to include? To answer this question, Dr. Sagan compiled his team. Dr. Frank Drake worked with Sagan on the Pioneer plaque in 1972, which, among other things, included the location of Earth, mapping it out via pulsars. Anne Droyan was a friend of Sagan's, and later his wife, and a young scientific novelist. She was put in charge of music selection. Timothy Ferris, at the time engaged to Droyan, was a writer for Rolling Stone who would go on to become the best scientific journalist of his generation. He helped pick the images that were to be included. John Lomberg had already been Dr. Sagan's artistic collaborator for several years. His job was to bring color and artistic beauty to what the interstellar beings would see. Finally, there was Linda Sagan, Carl's wife. She had created the artwork on the Pioneer plaque and was to help produce this project. The first order of business was to figure out how they were going to convey this message. The receptacle for this kind of message had to last for thousands of years and be simple to play. Drake suggested the old-school technology of a phonographic record. It was rather simple to play, and as long as the physical record itself was protected, it wouldn't erode over time. The etchings on a metallic phonographic record could last, according to estimations, for hundreds of millions of years with very little degradation. Additionally, they decided to make it a copper disc coated in gold, further protecting it from magnetic fields and heat, as well as placing it in a protective aluminium jacket. Coupled with an included needle and cartridge, an alien civilization would be able to play it. They also decided to design it to run at 16 2/3 revolutions per minute, as opposed to the normal 33 1/3 revolutions. This was done so they could jam as many pictures, music, greetings, and information onto the record as possible. In order to make sure that the aliens knew what to do with the disc, needle, and cartridge, symbols were etched into it, showing how it was to be used. For instance, to make sure that they knew what speed to rotate the record at, this is etched in binary arithmetic, expressed as a factor of the fundamental transition of the hydrogen atom. In order to demonstrate how the pictures are to be decoded and viewed, the upper right portion of the cover shows the analog signal that is the start of the picture, and in binary how the first 3 vertical lines are marked. On the face is also a carefully chosen picture of the first picture on the record for calibration purposes. Next, and possibly the most arduous task, was to determine what exactly would be on this record. The team wanted the golden record to represent life like it was on Earth, the sights, sounds, and feelings that we encounter every day. After much deliberation, 115 images encoded in analog form, including a picture of DNA, human anatomy, Olympic sprinters, an African heart, and a diagram of vertebrate evolution, and an audio track list with greetings, sounds, and music were included. The audio portion began with greetings in 55 languages. The first greeting, in English, was from then Secretary General of the United Nations, Kurt Waldheim. The rest of the greetings included ones in Sumerian, "May all be well," Zulu, "We greet you, great ones, we wish you longevity," Czech, "Dear friends, we wish you the best," and even a whale greeting. The next audio section was known as Sounds of Earth. They included things like a baby crying, a volcano erupting, birds calling, and a train roaring past. The last audio section was the music overseen by Anne Droyan. Among the tracks selected for this section was Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, a Pygmy Girl's Initiation song from Zaire, Peruvian panpipes and drums, and Johnny B. Good by Chuck Berry. Noticeably absent was any song from the Beatles. While the band wanted their hit Here Comes the Sun to be included, they didn't own the rights to their songs. Their publishing company, EMI, did, and they didn't allow it to happen. For everything the team included on this golden record, probably the most unique and telling inclusion was an EEG brain scan of a young woman who was newly in love. That woman turned out to be Anne Droyan. Droyan had planned on going through, to quote, "a mental itinerary of the ideas and individuals of history whose memory I hope to perpetuate," as well as thoughts of her fiancé Tim Ferriss while being connected to the EEG. But 2 days before the recording, something extraordinary happens. she fell in love with Dr. Carl Sagan. Days before, they had shared a rather intimate phone call where they ruminated about life when they both realized that they were in love with one another. They hadn't had a single date, nor a kiss, or even a romantic moment before this, but they decided to marry despite them both being in other relationships. It was a eureka moment for both of us. The idea that we could find the perfect match. It was a discovery that has been reaffirmed in countless ways since. As for the brain scan, she stated, "Earlier I had asked Carl if those putative extraterrestrials of 1 billion years from now could conceivably interpret the brainwaves of a meditator. Who knows? 1 billion years is a long, long time," was his reply. "On the chance that it might be possible, why don't we give it a try?" 2 days after our life-changing phone call, I entered a laboratory at Bellevue Hospital in New York City and was hooked up to a computer that turned all of the data from my brain and heart into sound. I had a 1-hour mental itinerary of all the information I wished to convey. I began thinking about the history of Earth and the life it sustains. To the best of my abilities, I tried to think of something of the history of ideas and human social organization. I thought about the predicament that our civilization finds itself in, and about the violence and poverty that make this planet a hell for so many of its inhabitants. Towards the end, I permitted myself a personal statement of what it was like to fall in love. On August 20th, 1977, Voyager 2 lifted off into space. Voyager 1 joined its twin 16 days later. Over the next 4 years, they explored and took snapshots of Jupiter and Saturn. In 1986, Voyager arrived at Uranus. By 1989, it had passed by Neptune. Voyager 1 officially entered interstellar space on August 25th, 2012, and as of July 29th, 2019, it is 145.87 astronomical units from Earth. It is the farthest away man-made object. With perhaps as many as 500 billion galaxies, each with billions of stars. For reference, the Milky Way has about 300 billion, many of which have planetary objects orbiting them. It seems absurd to think that we're alone in the universe, especially when we consider how relatively recently life popped up on our little rock and how old the universe is. The Voyager probes will orbit the Milky Way indefinitely, so you never know, one of them might just encounter an intelligent alien civilization, maybe even long after humans have gone the way of the dodo bird. And if that day does come when a Voyager golden record is found, first contact may well be dreadlocked predator-like extraterrestrials listening to Chuck Berry's Johnny Be Good. While this is certainly a long shot, as Sagan himself noted, the spacecraft will be encountered and the record played only if there are advanced spacefaring civilizations in interstellar space. But the launching of this bottle into the cosmic ocean says something very hopeful about life on this planet. As for US President Jimmy Carter, he had a message of his own which was placed on the record. "This is a present from our small, distant world, a token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time so that we may live into yours. We hope someday, having solved the problems we face, to join a community of galactic civilizations. This record represents our hope and our determination and our goodwill in a vast and awesome universe." And let's get into those bonus facts. In order to allow the recipients to view certain images in color, 3 consecutive images were used in these cases, each representing red, green, and blue. In order for them to determine whether they are calibrating it correctly, a picture of our sun was included. Using the pulsar map to locate it, the aliens should be able to directly compare our sun's exact color, which isn't yellow by the way, but in the human visible spectrum appears white with the image included. As one could imagine, despite the cute love story between Dr. Sagan and Androyan, there were pretty dire consequences due to their secret message. They both decided not to reveal it to their partners until the project was completed. But when they eventually did, it led to an 8-year legal battle between Carl and Linda, longer than it took for the Voyagers to pass by Jupiter.
In 1991, 2 men by the name of Doug Bauer and Dave Chorley rocked the worlds of ufologists and paranormal experts alike when they claimed to be the driving force behind the crop circle phenomenon of the late 1970s and beyond, using little more than a plank of wood and a length of rope. This was a claim self-professed experts on the phenomenon dismissed as ludicrous, until the 2 men showed everyone how they did it. Flanked by members of the press from across the world in a small field in Warminster, the 2 men proceeded proceeded to methodically push over wheat using wood planks. A few hours later, they stood in the middle of a crop circle so perfect, actual aliens armed with a spirograph would have struggled to make one that looked any better. The men then explained to the waiting cameras that they'd been making crop circles this way for well over a decade, starting in 1976, shortly before similar-looking crop circles suddenly started cropping up in other areas of the world. According to Chorley and Bauer, the decision to first start flattening wheat in 1976 was inspired by two things: a story Bauer had heard while living in Australia about mysterious circles appearing in sugarcane fields, and a few too many pints of beer. In regards to the former, Bauer was referring to a series of large, circular patterns that appeared in fields in Tully, Queensland, in the middle of the late 1960s. Unlike modern crop circles, which often feature amazingly complex patterns and uniform pressing of crops, the Tully saucer nests were simple, somewhat crude circles of destruction. Ufologists have long maintained that these circles were caused by UFOs landing and subsequently taking off, hence the name Tully saucer nests. The more accepted alternate theory is that they were simply caused by whirlwinds touching down very briefly. Whatever the case, after Bauer moved back to England, the two men became friends over a mutual appreciation of art and their favorite hobby, watercolor painting. They eventually began a weekly tradition of meeting for a few drinks on a Friday evening at the Percy Hobbs pub in nearby Winchester. One day in 1976, they decided to have their usual drinks outside and noticed the acres of pristine wheat surrounding them, which is when Bauer recalled the story he'd once told Chorley of the mysterious circles that had baffled experts in Australia. With a glint in his eye, Bauer turned to his friend and said, "How would you like a bit of a laugh?" That night, the men, using nothing more than a 5-foot iron bar Bauer used to secure the door to his picture framing store, created a huge circle in the middle of the wheat. Over the next 2 years, the men continued to create large circles in wheat fields, mostly around the area of Warminster in Wiltshire, because it was, according to Bauer, a well-known centre for UFO sightings, mostly limited to mysterious lights in the sky. After 2 years of creating crop circles with little to no interest from either the public or the press, Chorley expressed the desire to throw in the towel, this activity being quite time-consuming and physically intensive for a pair of elderly gentlemen. After contemplating the problem, Bauer theorized, for people to really take note of our circles, we needed a site with a viewpoint so people could sit having picnics and look down in wonder on our work. In early 1978, Bauer noticed that they were planting a new wheat crop in an area known as Cheesefoot Head, which was located in a well-known beauty spot popular with tourists. That summer, when the wheat was sufficiently grown, the two men came and made an 80-foot wide circle. 24 hours later, it was national news. Almost immediately after the circles came to public attention, numerous so-called experts began to come forward with varying explanations about their cause, attributing them variously to aliens, ghosts, supernatural entities, spirits angry with humanity about global warming, and even God. This amused Bauer and Chorley to no end, with Chorley later remarking, "They called us superior intelligence, and this was the biggest laugh of all." To further their little joke, the pair approached some of the self-professed experts, saying that they were wildlife enthusiasts who often trudged around the region and they'd be happy to keep an eye out for any more crop circles. Under this guise, the men would go make a crop circle and then place a few phone calls the following day telling the experts that they'd found another one in an effort to keep the hoax alive. Eventually, this became unnecessary as enthusiasts flocked to the region. In addition to stringing along the host of pseudoscientists who became fascinated with the crop circle phenomenon, Bauer and Chorley also took note of what real scientists were saying about them and adjusted their designs accordingly. For example, when meteorologists, who were specifically trying to debunk the same ufologists and pseudoscientists Bauer and Chorley were encouraging, suggested that because all the crop circles up to that point had been, well, circles, they were likely caused by downward spiraling winds. It was at this point that Bauer and Chorley began creating crop circles featuring a wide variety of geometric shapes. Though the designs of crop circles became ever more elaborate, the materials Bauer and Chorley used didn't change much over the years. It was noted that the most sophisticated piece of equipment used by either man was a sighting device made from a loop of wire hung through the visor of a baseball cap such that it dangled in front of the left eye, allowing them to check if their lines were straight. Other than this, their standard equipment was a plank of wood with rope through each end so they didn't have to bend over to pick it up. The designs for individual crop circles were usually drafted by Bauer in his workshop. In 1985, about a decade after the two men first started creating crop circles, Bauer's wife became convinced he was up to something when she noticed that their car's odometer was unusually high, far more so than could have been explained by simply heading off to the pub with Chorley every Friday night. When Bauer confessed that he'd been traipsing around the countryside flattening wheat, she didn't believe him. To prove he wasn't lying, Bauer asked his wife to design her own crop circle, which he then dutifully went and created in a nearby field for her. With his wife's blessing, Bauer and Chorley continued making crop circles for 6 more years, until they both decided it was time to come clean. This brings us back to 1991. Despite the evidence, including, among other things, detailed designs of every crop circle they'd created over the years, over 200 in all, many didn't believe them. Those who'd made a career talking about crop circles, and in some cases playing up the phenomenon to tourists, which is still a staple today in the region, which is largely why the farmers put up with it, flatly refused to believe that the two were telling the truth. Cereologists, the name crop circle experts refer to themselves as, cited the fact that other crop circles had appeared in other parts of the world that neither Bauer or Chorley could possibly take credit for. One serologist, Pat Delgado, was quoted by the New York Times derisively as saying, "Yesterday there were circles discovered on a prairie in Canada. Have these guys been out there with their board?" Of course, the less tinfoil hat explanation for the other crop circles is simply that Bauer and Chorley's crop circles inspired other like-minded pranksters, which is why they've appeared in places neither man visited after the pair started their little prank, and the circles are, after all, quite easy to create. On the other hand, perhaps the extraterrestrials or spirits simply have a sense of humor too, deciding to copy Chorley and Bauer's crop circle idea. When asked about why they decided to dedicate such a significant portion of their lives to flattening wheat into visually pleasing patterns in a 1999 article, Bauer waxed poetic about the time he'd spent with his friend, who sadly died in 1997 after a battle with cancer. It was just pure enjoyment on those beautiful summer nights for two artistic people under the stars amid all those cornfields. We were both 19th century people, really. We were in another world. I don't consider being on a planet for 60 years is much use if you don't leave your mark. We didn't want to make publicity, we just wanted to make fools of the experts who were springing up everywhere. My wife said Dave and I were like chalk and cheese, but we were a team in tune with nature. Other people made money out of the corn circles, the experts, the farmers who charged entry, but all Dave and I got was a really big laugh. But it's been a wonderful experience, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world. As to whether Bauer believes in extraterrestrials, he stated, "It's obvious that in all those millions of planets we saw out there in the night sky, there must be people out there." On October 30th, 1938, from the Mercury Theatre in New York City, Orson Welles broadcasted a modernized radio play of H.G. Wells's, no relation, 1898 novel, War of the Worlds. For the last 3/4 of the century, we've been told that this fictionalized CBS broadcast sent Americans into a panic, that citizens across the country did not realize that this was science fiction, despite the fact that it was explicitly stated at the beginning and twice during the broadcast, and they thought that the USA was under attack from an invading Martian army. Littered with realistic simulated news reports and eyewitness accounts, the hour-long broadcast was innovative and an extremely entertaining way to present the story. But the thing is, no such nationwide panic actually occurred. While there were certainly exceptions, documented evidence indicates that most who listened did know it was a dramatization and were completely aware that New Jersey was not being destroyed by visitors from outer space. Further, as you'll soon learn, the broadcast didn't have very good ratings when it first aired, so even if everyone who listened had thought it was real, it wouldn't have resulted in the level of mass hysteria commonly spoken of since. War of the Worlds first appeared in magazines simultaneously in the UK and the US in 1897. It was published in a book in 1898, and it is considered one of the most influential pieces of science fiction ever written. The Englishman, H.G. Herbert George Wells, was already quite a famous author by the time he got to Martians attacking Earth. In 1895, he published The Time Machine, as well as popularizing the term, The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, and The Invisible Man in 1897, directly before War of the Worlds, securing his position at the time as the world's best, if not truly the first, science fiction writer. After War of the Worlds, he went on to write several more books, including the non-fiction best-selling 3-volume Outline of History. As you might have guessed from all of this, H.G. H.G. Wells was quite a well-known writer in 1938, and his novels, including War of the Worlds, were widely read on both continents. So when Orson adapted the novel in 1938, there was nothing particularly new about the story itself. The differences came from the medium and structure of the storytelling. While the 1938 version told the story of the destruction of New Jersey, the 1898 original takes place in England, or more specifically, in Surrey and London. Another significant difference between the two works is that H.G.'s version is told through the eyes of an unnamed protagonist and his brother. Orson's is told through staged news broadcasts and reports. For instance, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, both the observations of science and the evidence of our eyes lead to the inescapable assumption that those strange beings just landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars." As for the number of listeners, as Orson stepped to the microphone in the evening of the day before Halloween in 1938, there were already several well-known factors that potentially were going to affect the number of people who were actually going to tune in to the broadcast that evening. For one, the very popular Chase and Sanborn Hour, a comedy variety show hosted by the ventriloquist Edgar Bergen, was airing at the exact same time on a competing radio station, NBC. Additionally, several major CBS affiliates, including in Boston, preempted the broadcast for local commercial programming. Further, as the program progressed, the C.E. Hopper Company called approximately 5,000 households to ask the question, "To what program are you listening?" C.E. Hopper was an American company that measured radio ratings for the major networks to see how much they could charge for advertising during a particular program, much like Nielsen ratings today for television. In fact, A.C. Nielsen bought C.E. Hopper in 1950. It turns out only 2% answered something in reference to War of the Worlds on CBS. None of these people spoke of any news broadcast or special bulletin about aliens either. So besides very few listening in, it would seem that those who were all knew it was just a story, which perhaps shouldn't be a surprise seeing as it was announced at the beginning and twice during the broadcast. So how did the radio broadcast of War of the Worlds created mass hysteria myth get perpetuated? In short, the media. Newspaper headlines across the country gave the impression that panic had gripped the nation. "Fake radio war stirs terror through US," was reported in the New York Daily News, accompanied with a picture of a frightened man and a woman with an arm sling whose caption read, "War victim." Terror by radio could be found in a New York Times editorial. The newspaper industry had quite a bone to pick with the new medium of radio. As W. Joseph Campbell of American University wrote in the BBC News magazine in 2011 for the 73rd anniversary of the broadcast, the so-called panic broadcast brought to newspapers an exceptional opportunity to censor radio, a still new medium that was becoming a serious competitor in providing news and advertising. That same New York Times editorial with the inflammatory headline had this to say about its new competitor. "Radio is new, but it has adult responsibilities. It has not mastered itself or the material it uses." Additionally, the newspapers also wanted to sell papers, and what better way to do that than using words like terror or panic or war? Using anecdotal and scattered stories, they made it seem like many citizens were ready to bear arms against the alien invaders, but in truth those stories were either very few and far between, or in some cases completely made up. According to law enforcement and hospital documentation from the night in question, there were no reports of people taking to the streets with guns, no one was taken to the hospital on the account of the radio broadcast, and no known person committed suicide as a result of the broadcast. The only noticeable effect was that law enforcement saw a small spike in calls in the New Jersey area, the site of the supposed attack on the evening in question, with most simply asking whether the broadcast was a hoax and calling to find out more information. As David Miller points out in his textbook, Introduction to Collective Behavior, some callers requested information, some people called to find out where they could go to donate blood, some callers were simply angry that such a realistic show was allowed to air, while others called CBS to congratulate Mercury Theatre for the exciting Halloween program. But in the end, there was no massive panic, and the small spike in calls to the police is one of the few bits of evidence we have that at least a small percentage of the listeners had concerns or complaints over the broadcast. Quite simply, newspapers created the panic after the fact, including US newspapers writing publishing nearly 13,000 articles on it over the next month. The public swallowed up the newspaper's reports, and radio and CBS in particular were happy to embrace the claims as a demonstration of the power of the new medium, which was good for advertising dollars and for ratings. Orson Welles himself believed there had been a mass panic, rather than simply as it was a small percentage of the US population listening in believing it was real for a little while, despite that during the broadcast it was stated that it wasn't. The myth of the nationwide panic has perpetuated itself ever since. As to the motivation behind presenting the story as real, Orson Welles had this very pertinent thing to say, considering the misinformation the newspapers would spread about the broadcast. "We were fed up with the way in which everything that came over this new magic box, the radio, was being swallowed. People, do suspect what they read in the newspapers and what people tell them, but when the radio came, and I suppose now television, anything that came through that new medium was believed. So, in a way, our broadcast was an assault on the credibility of that medium. We wanted people to understand that they shouldn't take any opinion pre-digested, and they shouldn't swallow everything that came through the tap, whether it was radio or not. But as I say, it was only a partial experiment. We had no idea the extent of the thing."
For those not familiar with this meme, the basic idea is to substitute X with any perceived extremely powerful entity that it would be futile to resist. An example of this can be seen when Ken Jennings, after losing to IBM's Watson on Jeopardy in 2011, wrote underneath his final Jeopardy answer, "I for one welcome our new computer overlords." While you'll often read that this was originally a line spoken by actress Joan Collins in the 1977 film Empire of the Ants, this is incorrect. Nowhere in this movie does any actor or actress say that. And as we read many conflicting accounts of this from otherwise reputable sources, we confirmed it is not spoken in this movie by watching the whole amazingly awful yet surprisingly unintentionally humorous horror film where, to quote, "A heavenly paradise becomes a hellish nightmare when a toxic spill turns harmless ants into gigantic rampaging monster insects." The closest thing to this statement anyone says in the film is after Joan Collins' character, Marilyn Fraser, enters into an enclosed space with the queen ant. The queen then sprays her with mind-controlling pheromones. When Fraser went into the chamber, she was screaming and trying to escape. When she steps out, she looks back at the rest of her party, who are also seemingly about to be put into the chamber, and says, "Don't you see? We mustn't disobey them. We must take care of them, and we must help them." So why do so many people credit this film as the meme's origin? While the line "I for one welcome" was never spoken in the film, when the actual authors of the line came up with it, they were alluding to Empire of the Ants' plot of giant ants enslaving humanity to work in sugar factories. So now the question arises, well, who actually came up with this line? The first known instance of this phrase can be found in the 1994 Season 5 episode of The Simpsons called Deep Space Homer. In this episode, Homer is selected by NASA to be sent into space. While in the space shuttle floating around trying to eat potato chips before they clog the instrument panels, Homer smashes into the ant colony on board, breaking the glass and releasing all the ants. When one of the floating ants gets close to the camera, it looks extremely large, prompting Simpsons anchorman Kent Brockman to think it is a giant ant. He then states the following: "Ladies and gentlemen, we've lost the picture, but what we've seen speaks for itself. The Corvair spacecraft has apparently been taken over, conquered, if you will, by a master race of giant space ants. It's difficult to tell from this vantage point whether they will consume the captive Earthmen or merely enslave them. One thing is for certain, there is no stopping them. The ants will soon be here. And I, for one, welcome our new insect overlords. I'd like to remind them that as a trusted TV personality, I can be helpful in rounding up others to toil in their underground sugar caves." And now for a bonus fact. In an interview Ken Jennings stated about the supercomputer Watson, Watson has lots in common with a top-ranked human Jeopardy player. It's very smart, very fast, speaks in an uneven monotone, and has never known the touch of a woman. Despite the CIA's release of previously classified documents in 2013 that acknowledge the existence of Area 51 as a top-secret US government research facility, many questions about the site remain unanswered. One of the most innocuous but nonetheless puzzling is its choice of name. So why exactly is it called Area 51?
Situated in the desert in southern Nevada, within the boundaries of the Nellis Air Force Range, NAFR, and just outside of the northeast corner of the Nevada Test Site, NTS, Area 51 and its neighbors, which includes the Tonopah Test Range, TTR, have hosted some of the most significant weapon testing performed on the planet during the 20th century. In addition to isolation, the 3.5 million acre region around and including Area 51 boasts other qualities that make it an excellent place to conduct secret tests and training. The dry climate provides superior flying conditions, the variety of terrain helps with gunnery practice, and several dry lake beds are available for emergency landings, including notably Groom Lake, situated just north of Area 51. Therefore, beginning in 1940, public land in the region was set aside and private land was condemned in order to establish the Las Vegas Bombing and Gunnery Range, LVBGR, today the NAFR and TTR, which was used throughout World War II as an aerial gunnery range for Army Air Corps pilots. As the Cold War began, there was a perceived need for the development and testing of nuclear weapons, and the barren and relatively uninhabited region surrounding Area 51 was identified as an ideal location, and as such, a large swath of the southern portion of the LVBGR was set aside as the aforementioned NTS for testing a variety of nuclear items. Despite the fact that Las Vegas is only 65 miles from its southeast edge, those involved in the site choice minimized any potential danger to the population, with Enrico Fermi opining that people will receive perhaps a little more ionizing radiation than medical authorities say is absolutely safe. In any event, nuclear testing began at the NTS in its southeastern corner at a place known as Frenchman Flat, FF, on January 27, 1951. After the 4 remaining devices of the Ranger series were detonated and studied, also at FF, the locations of nearly all further testing, with a handful of notable exceptions at NTS, were thereafter identified by their area numbers, beginning with the Buster Jangle series in October to November 1951 in Area 7. This was to ensure that it allowed anyone in the know to know where a test would be conducted, and the same system is still used today. According to an official NTS guide, the test areas were assigned unique numbers as they were designated, and, as can be seen from a map of the NTS, early on the area assignments were randomly made to avoid a set pattern. Nonetheless, the Atomic Energy Commission (AEC) personnel who assigned the test areas took a rational approach and began with essentially numbers 1 through 30. Note that not every numeral between 1 and 30 appears on the NTS map, notably missing are 13, 21, 24, and 28. Nonetheless, these numbers were apparently used to designate areas for atomic testing in the region, albeit outside of the set-aside NTS zone. For example, an Area 13 was designated just north of the NTS in the NAFR, while Area 24 refers to an area in the North Las Vegas facility, a satellite site of the NTS, managed by the National Nuclear Safety Administration's Nevada Site Office, NNSA. Area 28 was originally designated in the southwestern part of the NTS in the vicinity of Areas 25 and 27, which it was absorbed into. Area 21 is less easy to identify, although there is a technical Area 21 at Los Alamos National Laboratory, LANL, in north-central New Mexico. However, as that site has its own extensive numbering system, it is doubtful it is the missing NTS area. Regardless, although the LANL areas may be unrelated, it is clear that NTS-related nuclear testing was done outside of its territorial boundaries, but included within its numbering system. For example, in Area 13, an experiment called Project 57 was run on April 24, 1957, to explore whether or not the explosive charge of a nuclear warhead could self-destruct the weapon without causing an atomic explosion. Likewise, 4 other extraterritorial experiments, Double Tracks and Clean Slate 1, 2, and 3, to observe non-nuclear detonation of nuclear weapons were performed on the TTR at a site designated as Area 52 in May and June 1963. Similarly, at Area 58 on October 26, 1963, near Fallon, Nevada, well outside of the NTS, the Shoal experiment involved the detonation of a 12-kiloton bomb 1,200 feet below the Earth's surface just to observe the earthquake effects. While not conclusive, the fact that areas were designated well into the 50s supports the inference that Area 51 was a part of that pattern. Also compelling is the fact that Tonopah's Area 52 is likely just as close to, yet also just outside of, the NTS. And while it should come as no surprise that there are no direct records of nuclear testing activities at the secretive Area 51, there is a notable entry on the National Resource Defense Council's NRDC comprehensive list of nuclear tests from 1945 to 1992, which may be relevant. Note that this list provides the name of every event, e.g. Trinity, Fat Man, or Shoal, as well as its date, location, usually detailed, such as Alamogordo, New Mexico, or NTS Area 3, the lab that ran the test, e.g. LA for Los Alamos, the device type, such as whether it was dropped from a tower or plane or down a shaft, the height and depth of the burst, and its purpose, e.g. WR for weapons related. Regarding the NTS-related tests, other than the Frenchman Flat FF experiments, only 6 were not identified on the list by an area number. The 4 performed at Area 52, which were designated Bombing Range NV, the Shoal at Area 58, which was designated Fallon NV, and a third run on May 10, 1962. The last was a shaft test performed on a weapons-related device attributed to the NTS, but with no area or other location designated. In addition, neither the lab that ran the test nor the height or depth of the burst are recorded, and instead question marks are inserted under those categories on the list. Obviously, this list isn't conclusive, and the name of the event is consistent with contemporaneous tests conducted by the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. However, it is curious, and when combined with Area 51's proximity to the NTS, the site's history of extreme secrecy, its consecutive numbering with neighboring test areas, and the fact that the experiment was conducted in the region 1 year prior to those performed at Area 52, together these factors present a circumstantial case that Area 51 was designated as part of the NTS numbering system.